Hey guys, tonight we step straight into the heart of a medieval battlefield camp, the kind of place that smells of trampled earth, horse sweat, and the faint sourness of last night's stew still bubbling somewhere in a half-burned pot. You can almost feel the weight of the march still clinging to your legs, the ache in your calves, the blisters in your boots that no amount of straw stuffing can soften, and that bone-deep exhaustion that tells you sleep should be your reward. But here, in the middle of a war zone, sleep is not guaranteed, and comfort is an outright luxury. You're about to find out exactly how men tried to rest in tents without freezing to death, and spoiler alert, you probably wouldn't survive the night. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love knowing whether you're drifting off in Los Angeles at 10 p.m, or maybe you're in Dhaka, already, way past midnight, blinking at your phone while the ceiling fan hums above you. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the mud, the kind of mud that seems deliberately designed to pull your boots right off your feet, thick, sticky, and endlessly hungry. The camp sprawls out in front of you. Not some neatly arranged grid like modern military bases, but a chaotic spread of tents, wagons, and fire pits, smoking low under the damp evening air. Horses stamp and snort on the edges, their breath rising in cloudy plumes. Men stagger with armfuls of poles and heavy rolls of canvas, trying to hammer their little slice of shelter into a ground that does not want to cooperate. The sky above is not a friend tonight. It's the color of lead, swollen with clouds that threaten rain or snow or both. And somewhere deep inside, you're wondering, where exactly do you fit in? The answer, not comfortably. You're just one body in a mass of soldiers who have all tramped for miles with packs digging into their shoulders. That sense of finally making camp feels less like relief and more like another chore. Tents don't pitch themselves after all. The canvas sheets that pass for portable housing are heavy, stinking of mildew from the last rain, and patched, in more places than you can count. Wooden poles are uneven, some cracked, some splintering under the weight. Hammering in pegs takes time, and the ground is sometimes frozen solid, sometimes so soft you might as well be planting them in porridge. By the time you and your tent mates wrestle one into place, the light has all but died, replaced by smoky torches and the uneven flicker of campfires. You notice quickly that tents are not private. Forget the idea of a cozy two-person camping trip. This is a glorified canvas bag stuffed with 6 to 10 men, depending on rank and the size of the unit. The stink of sweat and leather mingles with damp wool, creating a scent strong enough to make your eyes water if you weren't already used to it. You crawl in, ducking your head, only to find every surface damp, either from ground moisture creeping up or condensation dripping down. The floor is nothing but bare earth unless you've been lucky enough to scavenge straw, pine boughs, or something similar to make a crude mat. And you know, deep down, you're not going to wake up refreshed. You'll wake up stiff, shivering, and half resentful of the dawn. As you try to settle, your mind wanders to how soldiers across different armies handled this first stage of camp. Chroniclers from the 100 Years' War describe encampments that stretched for miles, whole temporary towns springing up with soldiers, camp followers, and merchants crowding together. Some armies, like the Romans before them, prided themselves on discipline and order, marking out neat rows with measured space. Medieval camps, much more chaotic. Rank dictated space. Knights and officers got larger, better tents, sometimes carried by wagons, while ordinary infantry crammed together like sardines. There's an odd comfort in knowing hierarchy never sleeps, even when you desperately want to. And still, despite the weariness, danger lurks. Fires must be watched carefully, canvas burns fast, and one stray spark could light a whole line of tents before anyone had the chance to shout a warning. The memory of more than one medieval campaign includes sudden infernos sweeping through night camps, leaving men scrambling barefoot in the dark, which means tonight, no fire inside. You can see them instead. Glowing points scattered across the field, warming those who stand watch or those willing to risk dozing nearby, but never close enough to keep the inside of your tent from biting cold. That's why men turn to each other for warmth. It might feel awkward to think about now, but in the middle of winter, personal space is a luxury you can't afford. Bodies pressed together, cloaks shared across shoulders, breath mingling in the dark. It's not comfort, it's survival. There's a strange camaraderie in it though. You hear muffled laughter, grumbles and snoring all at once. A chorus of men too tired to care that someone's elbow is wedged into their ribs. One fellow mutters about home, another curses his boots, another quietly whispers a prayer to St. Christopher. Sleep doesn't come easily. Outside, hooves clatter as patrols check the perimeter, and the faraway howl of a dog cuts through the night. Every now and then, the clash of steel from some poor soul practicing or showing off reminds you you're never fully safe. Even here, exhaustion is the only blanket thick enough to pull you under. But as you lie there, shivering, you realize something fascinating. This ritual of setting up tents and carving out space in hostile landscapes is as old as organized warfare itself. The materials differ, linen or hemp, wool or canvas, but the problem never changes. How do you keep death from creeping in while you sleep? Some soldiers swore by piling cloaks underneath to block the damp, while others claimed the trick was to never take your boots off, lest you wake up too stiff to march. Historians still argue whether the men genuinely managed much sleep at all, or whether they drifted in and out, half-conscious, through long stretches of discomfort. And yet, despite all the misery, there are glimmers of human stubbornness. You remember one odd account. Soldiers in a Burgundian camp during the 15th century supposedly brought little sprigs of herbs into their tents. Lavender, thyme, even rosemary, not just to ward off foul smells, but as makeshift charms against sickness. Whether it helped or not, it gave them something to cling to, a whisper of home in a canvas world. Maybe tonight, tucked into your itchy wool blanket, with the damp creeping up your spine, you'd cling to something too, a memory of warmth, a bit of hope that morning might come sooner than expected. You shuffle closer into the tent, but the day's work is not finished. The structure around you, sagging slightly at the edges and creaking when the wind shifts, did not rise on its own. Long before any soldier could crawl inside to shiver away, the night there was the business of putting canvas to earth, and that was as exhausting as the march itself. You can almost hear the curses that fly through the camp when someone realizes a peg has snapped, or that the rope meant to keep the ridge taut has frayed into threads. The medieval tent is not some tidy modern contraption with color-coded poles and instructions printed in neat diagrams. No, this is heavy canvas, rough hemp rope, wooden poles cut from trees dragged across miles, and hands already blistered from gripping spears and shields all day. Setting one up requires patience, strength, and more than a little stubbornness, because without it, there is no hope of surviving the cold night ahead. Imagine the scene as evening falls, soldiers hauling great sheets of stiff, damp fabric off, wagons, the air filling with the smell of mold and rain still clinging to the fibers. Someone hammers a stake into the soil with the butt of an axe, while another man strains to keep a pole upright, his shoulders trembling as the wind pushes back. The noise of hammers striking wood and curses muttered under breath mix with the groaning of oxen and the creak of carts rolling to a halt. You can see the tent take shape only slowly, a crooked triangle against the horizon that has to be coaxed into steadiness by sheer will. The moment one side stands, the other collapses, and the process begins again. No one here mistakes this. For glamorous work, it is sweaty, tedious, and painfully necessary. There were times when tents weren't even available to all. The wealthier knights, with their household retinues and pack animals, could afford large pavilions striped with bright colors, complete with banners snapping proudly in the wind. Some were tall enough to let a man stand upright, even decorated, with painted symbols so they could be spotted across the field. For the common foot soldier, though, The reality was something closer to a rough lean-to. Canvas strung over a branch or a spear, pegged down as best as possible, and hoped to withstand the elements. You might crawl inside with half your body still exposed, knowing full well that if the rain blew sideways, and it often did, you'd be soaked through before sleep even brushed your eyelids. The difference between knight and peasant was etched into the very walls, or lack thereof, of the knight's shelter. And yet the tent was never just a bedchamber. It was a tiny fortress against the weather, and men took pride in setting them up right. Manuals from later centuries talk about the correct way to orient a tent door, preferably away from prevailing winds, and to dig shallow trenches around the perimeter so rainwater wouldn't turn the floor into a swamp. Whether soldiers in every army followed this advice is another matter. Some accounts praise the neat order of certain encampments, rows of tents lined like houses on a street, while others describe sprawling chaos where tents leaned into each other like drunken men. Historians still argue whether this depended on the discipline of the commander or the simple reality that, when you're exhausted and cold, perfection doesn't matter as much as having a piece of canvas overhead before the sky opens again. What's striking too is the ingenuity men showed in the smallest details. Soldiers might cut pine branches to lay beneath the tent floor, not only to soften the ground, but to keep the damp earth from sucking warmth out of their bodies. Some tucked spare cloaks along the edges to block drafts. One chronicle even hints that in desperate winters, men mix straw with animal dung to plaster gaps near the base, sealing the cold out with something foul but effective. It's the sort of improvisation you don't like to think about as you try to picture yourself lying there, but survival makes philosophers of everyone. You can imagine the frustration of building in bad weather. Picture men in a downpour, canvas, turning slick and heavy, ropes tightening like iron in their hands as they strain to keep the tent from blowing away. The ground becomes a battlefield of its own, mud swallowing stakes faster than they can be hammered in. Someone slips, landing, hard on his back, with a laugh that sounds more bitter than amused. Another man throws down a mallet in disgust, declaring he'd rather fight 3 battles in a row than struggle another hour with wet ropes. The tent in these moments seems like an enemy, all on its own. And still, somehow, by stubborn teamwork, it gets done. The tent once stood as a symbol of status as much as shelter. In tournaments and on campaign, noble pavilions often mimicked houses, with awnings, painted fabric, even rugs laid inside. Chroniclers mention the brilliant silks of Byzantine tents, their walls dyed crimson or indigo, glowing like jewels in torchlight. For common men, though, color was rare. Most tents were an unappealing shade of dirty white or brown, the fabric stained from repeated use. But even here, among drab shelters, you'd sometimes find a touch of humor or rebellion. Soldiers carving, little marks into wooden poles, or hanging charms from the guy ropes, small tokens to claim this patch of earth as their own, however briefly. One soldier's amulet might be a bone carved with a crude face. Another's a scrap of ribbon from a sweetheart at home. They were tiny touches of personality in an otherwise uniform sea of canvas misery. There is a curious debate among modern historians about just how portable these tents were meant to be. Some argue that many were so heavy and unwieldy that moving them day after day must have been nearly impossible, suggesting that large armies only pitched them during longer halts, while quick campaigns relied more on natural shelters or improvised lean-tos. Others counter that soldiers were used to dragging heavy loads, and that an army of thousands had enough manpower to break down and carry tents as needed. You, standing in the thick of the camp tonight, don't have the luxury of scholarly argument. You see only the immediate reality. Without this sagging canvas above your head, you're just one more body in the open, shivering until dawn. By the time your tent finally stands upright, your arms ache as though you've swung a sword for hours. Your palms are sore and your clothes are soaked with sweat. You crawl inside, ducking under the flap, and collapse onto the bare earth with a sigh that feels as old as warfare itself. Around you, other tents rise like crooked teeth across the muddy field, their outlines glowing faintly in the firelight. It isn't beautiful, and it isn't comfortable, but it is something. A fragile barrier between your body and the night. You breathe in the damp canvas smell, hear the wind rattle the guy ropes, and know this is the closest thing to home you'll get before the march begins again tomorrow. You duck back inside the sagging canvas, and the real trial begins. Not the march, not the hammering of stakes or the dragging of poles, but the slow, almost humiliating process of fitting your weary body into a space already claimed by half, a dozen others. The tent that looked just about adequate from the outside shrinks the moment you crawl in. There's a low roof pressing close above your head, poles in the way of any stretch you might have dreamed of, and the sour smell of damp wool and unwashed men smothering every breath. The warmth of the day, what little there was, has bled away, leaving only the cold of night that slips under the canvas and clings to every bone. And here you are, squeezed shoulder to shoulder with comrades who are more obstacle than comfort. You can feel the proximity instantly, the brush of an elbow against your ribs, the prickle of someone's coarse beard almost grazing your cheek. When he shifts, the sharp jab of a knee against your thigh, because the space doesn't allow for graceful arrangements. Everyone is exhausted, everyone is irritable, and no one has enough room. Boots pile near the flap in a stinking heap, though some men keep them on, swearing that removing them invites frostbite or theft. A shield, too heavy to drag outside, leans across your leg like an unwelcome guest, and above it hangs a dented helmet that clinks every time the wind nudges the tent wall. This is no private chamber. It's a sardine tin stitched from canvas. The strange part is how quickly you begin to adjust. The discomfort becomes normal, the closeness almost expected. Soldiers in every century have learned that survival means sharing, and in this tent, sharing is everything. Warmth, space, even breath. You roll closer to a fellow on your left, not because you like him, truth be told, you don't, but because his body radiates a little heat that you can steal. Another man's snoring rattles through the space like a drumbeat, but it's oddly reassuring, a sign that someone at least is managing to sleep. The sound of steady breath is proof that exhaustion has conquered misery, and you cling to that as evidence that maybe, just maybe, you'll drift off too. Accounts from campaigns remind us that tents rarely sheltered, only those they were meant for. Stragglers, servants, even boys acting as squires often wormed their way inside once the flap dropped. The result was chaos. Bodies packed so tightly that men sometimes had to sleep sitting up, backs pressed together, or in a line like spoons, the man in front feeling the nose of the one behind nestled in the hollow of his neck. It's the kind of closeness that would make you laugh in daylight and cringe at in memory. But at night it was necessity. The human body, after all, gives off heat, and in the frozen dark, that was as valuable as any blanket. There's an odd little detail from chronicles of the Burgundian Wars. Soldiers would sometimes rotate positions through the night. The men, in the middle, buried under the press, were warmest, while those at the edges froze. So, like a human rotisserie, men rolled inward and outward at intervals, sharing both warmth and discomfort. It sounds absurd, like some grim parody of camaraderie, but when your choice is between shivering to death or spooning your enemy, the decision is simple. You don't debate dignity with frost. And yet, there is debate among historians about whether this practice was universal or exaggerated. Some argue that while close sleeping was unavoidable, this constant rotating was more of a moral tale told by chroniclers, proof of unity, of shared suffering, a way to glorify hardship. Others insist the detail is too strange not to be true, the kind of behavior no scribe would invent without hearing it firsthand. You, caught in the claustrophobic heat of your canvas prison, can believe it. Every shuffle, every reposition, every grumble about a numb arm suggests that movement is inevitable, and sharing the misery seems the only way to endure it. Hierarchy doesn't dissolve in the dark either. Rank dictates who lies where. A knight or officer claims the center where drafts cannot reach, while common men lie along the edges, closest to the biting air that sneaks under the canvas. The lowliest might end up half outside, their legs or arms stiff with cold by dawn. Complaints are useless. No one wants to challenge authority when the same sword that leads you in battle can easily shove you aside in the tent. This layering of bodies mirrors the layering of society, privilege even in sleep, comfort rationed by birth or pay. You find yourself wondering if warmth tastes sweeter when it's stolen from someone else's breath. Noise is its own torment. Beyond the flap, horses shuffle and stamp, iron-shod hooves striking the frozen ground. A distant laugh rises from the fires where the lucky or the reckless drink away their aches. Closer still, coughs echo like muted thunder, rough and phlegmy, betraying the spread of sickness that no one dares name. Inside, it's worse. Snores that rattle like saws through wood, teeth grinding, muttered prayers, even the faint sobbing of someone who can't hold his fear in. Sleep, if it comes, must wrestle its way past a cacophony of sounds. You close your eyes and try to imagine silence. But silence in a tent full of soldiers is a myth. One curious note from medieval sources is that men often propped shields or spears along the tent walls, not only for readiness, but as a crude form of insulation. The layered wood and metal created a barrier, blocking some of the wind. The sight is almost comical. Weapons meant for battle serving instead as wallpaper against the cold. But practicality trumps pride in the field, and so the walls bristle, with spears while men huddle beneath them, pretending this arsenal makes them cozier. Perhaps it does, in some small way, if only by convincing the mind that preparation equals safety. Lying there, you cannot stretch, cannot breathe deeply, cannot forget that your comrades' bodies are as much part of your bed as the straw beneath you. Yet there is also something fragile, almost tender in this closeness. The same men who mocked you on the march or shoved you aside at the fire are now the only barrier between you and the cold night. Their heat keeps you alive. Their bulk shields you from the draft. You resent them, and you need them, and that contradiction hums in the air like a second heartbeat. Sleep will come slowly, awkwardly, and never fully. But when it does, it will come to you all together, tangled in the same misery, bound by the same canvas, breathing the same sour air, and dreaming perhaps of a bed you once had long ago, before war taught you that even rest can feel like battle. The tent has settled around you, the bodies pressed together like firewood stacked too tightly to breathe. But now comes the nightly puzzle every soldier faces. What exactly should you do with the layers of clothing still clinging to your body? You've marched all day in them. Woolen tunic damp with sweat, hose stretched and sagging, cloak heavy with the smells of rain and smoke. And the question gnaws at you like a rat in the corner. Do you strip down, risking the night's bitter chill creeping into your skin, or do you keep everything on, knowing the sweat trapped beneath those layers may freeze like a second enemy? It's a choice without a right answer. One of those small decisions that feels absurdly significant when the difference between warmth and frostbite is only a thread away. The temptation, of course, is to peel it all off, to roll out of your clammy tunic, wriggle free of hose that cling unpleasantly, and let your body breathe for once. But the moment you imagine baring yourself to the night air, you can feel the sting of cold against skin, the way it cuts sharp as steel. Even inside the tent, the air is damp, and the draft slides through gaps in the canvas like the fingers of something mean-spirited. Once the heat leaves your body, it's gone, and there's no easy way to claw it back. Stripping feels almost like surrendering. You think of stories of soldiers found stiff in the morning, their sweat-soaked shirts frozen solid as boards against their flesh. That vision is enough to keep your arms inside your sleeves, no matter how itchy they feel, yet leaving it all on is no comfort either. Wool has its virtues. It insulates, it traps air, it clings with stubborn loyalty. But too much, and it smothers. If you've sweated through your layers, the dampness becomes your jailer. You shift in your spot, aware of the fabric plastered against your back, cold and clammy, while the warmth you thought you were preserving turns on you, leaching away. You hear one man mutter that he'd rather wake up naked than damp, and another bark back that naked men are the first corpses in a campaign. Their argument peters out, not because either has won, but because exhaustion silences them both. Still, you're left with the reminder that there is no perfect rule for sleeping attire. Here, it's a gamble either way. The chronicles of campaigns hint at the same quandary. Accounts from winter marches across the Alps describe soldiers layering cloaks upon cloaks, wrapping themselves like human onions, while others swore by sleeping in nothing but their underclothes, convinced that dryness mattered more than bulk. Some swore that removing boots let the feet dry and breathe, others that it invited death by frost. Every soldier seemed to have his own doctrine, passed down, like sacred law, and everyone contradicted the next. Historians argue still whether layering thick was wiser than stripping thin, pointing to fragments of evidence that contradict themselves. But as you lie in your own sweat, the scholarly debate feels less like an academic exercise and more like the gnawing misery of choice in the dark. There's a peculiar tidbit that slips into the story here. In certain regions, soldiers carried small pouches of dried herbs, sage, thyme, even crushed juniper, that they sprinkled inside their tunics before sleep. It wasn't fashion, and it wasn't medicine exactly. The herbs were thought to warm the body, or at the very least, to mask the odor of sweat and mildew. Imagine the tent filled with the faint aroma of rosemary, half illusion, half comfort, while outside the snow drifted against the ropes. It might not have cured the cold, but perhaps it convinced the mind to endure a little longer. After all, survival is not just body, it is belief. You cannot help but notice how the hierarchy of clothing mirrors the hierarchy of rank. A knight might possess fine furs, trimmed cloaks lined with squirrel or fox, luxuries that trap heat with ridiculous efficiency. You, by contrast, are wrapped in rough wool, scratchy against the skin, and patched so many times the original garment is lost under layers of repairs. One man's cloak smells faintly of smoke from a hearth back home, while another's reeks of wet dog. The disparity is obvious even in the dark. One side of the tent rustles in the plush sound of fur, while the other scratches endlessly at the bites of fleas stirred awake by old wool. Fairness, like comfort, doesn't make the march. Still, when the draft curls under the canvas, when the cold stabs sharp enough to make you curl tighter into yourself, you realize that every layer matters, no matter how foul or itchy. Your cloak, stiff with dried mud at the hem, becomes a blanket. The spare shirt you meant to keep clean for Sunday Mass becomes padding beneath your back. Even your belt, loosened but not cast off, keeps the fabric tight to your body, sealing, warmth in pockets close to the skin. Each item of clothing is no longer just an outfit. It's a tool, a shield, a bargaining chip against the night's bite. And so, as the tent fills with shifting, shivering bodies, each man experiments with his own solution. One strips bare to his shirt, curling into his cloak like a worm in its casing. Another bundles himself so tightly, he looks like a roll of cloth dumped on the floor. You, caught between them, feel the indecision tug at you, and realize there is no universal wisdom, only the stubborn hope that whichever choice you make will carry you to dawn. The canvas rattles, the air grows colder, and you pull the wool tighter around your shoulders, knowing that tonight, as in every campaign, survival is stitched not just from bravery or steel, but from the quiet personal rituals of sleep. The ground beneath you is unyielding, a cold slab of earth that presses every stone and clump of frozen mud into your bones. You shift, roll, tuck your knees, stretch out, only to find each position as miserable as the last. The tent, for all, its sagging canvas and rattling ropes, has at least blocked the wind. But the floor, it is the enemy no cloak can soften on its own. That is why the nightly ritual of bedding matters so much, even if bedding is a word that feels too generous for what soldiers actually had. No feather beds or linen sheets here, just scratchy mats, bundles of straw and wool blankets, that itch like nettles and weigh heavy as sin. And yet, when you're tired enough, even this pitiful arrangement becomes a promise of rest. Picture the soldiers gathering straw at dusk, dragging armfuls of dry stalks from nearby fields or scavenging bundles from supply wagons. The air fills with the rustle and snap of stalks breaking, the faint, sweet scent of hay clinging to the night. Each man shakes out his share onto the ground inside the tent, spreading it with rough hands until it forms a crude pallet. It doesn't look like much, uneven, prickly, full of dust that tickles your nose and makes your throat itch, but it raises your body a precious inch above the damp earth. That inch matters more than you'd think. The earth, when it touches you directly, leaches warmth like a thief. The straw, flimsy as it seems, breaks that theft, trapping pockets of air that offer the faintest insulation. You lie down and feel it scratch against your cheek, but also notice how the cold doesn't bite quite so sharply. Not all straw is equal, though. The lucky soldier finds dry, clean stalks that give off a pleasant smell, almost like home, reminding him of barns and fields before the march tore him away. The unlucky one ends up with damp, mold-speckled scraps, crawling with fleas and itching, powder waiting to erupt against bare skin. You hear the grumbles, the swats, the muttered curses in the dark, as someone realizes his mattress is alive. Sleep comes slower to him, his rest broken by scratching, but even he knows it's better than nothing at all. Better an itchy back than a frozen one. For those with a little more privilege, knights, officers, wealthy men, the bedding grew fancier. Accounts from campaigns describe feather-stuffed sacks carried on wagons, mattresses sewn with linen covers, blankets lined with fur. Imagine the luxury of sinking into feathers while your men lie groaning on straw. The contrast could not be starker. One man drifts into dreams cushioned in softness, while another curls on the ground with his arm for a pillow, grateful if he isn't pressed into the mud. Bedding, like food, became another way rank divided. Men, another reminder that war did not erase class, even in the tent. And still, improvisation thrived. Soldiers with no straw at hand laid cloaks flat on the earth, or piled branches of pine and fir beneath them, the resin filling the tent with a sharp forest scent that masked the odor of sweat. Some laid shields on the ground, sleeping atop them as a crude floorboard, the hard wood at least cleaner than dirt. Others gathered moss or leaves, stuffing them into sacks, making makeshift pillows to cradle their aching heads. There is a story of one company that, desperate for insulation, mixed animal dung into clay and spread it under their tents, hardening it into a raised platform that kept them above the wet. It sounds foul, and no doubt it was, but when the frost crept in, those soldiers slept warmer than their comrades who scoffed at the method. Necessity made ingenuity smell less offensive. You notice, too, how much blankets matter. A wool blanket, thick and scratchy, is both comfort and curse. It itches, irritates, leaves you tossing as the fibers dig into your skin, but it traps heat like nothing else. You pull it over your head, cocoon yourself inside, and suddenly the sound of the camp fades, muffled by the fabric, your own breath, warming the little cave. But wool, once wet, is a cruel master. If you've dragged it through rain or sweat into it too much, it clings damply, smelling of sheep and mildew, refusing to dry. You lie there, swaddled in something that feels more like a sponge than a blanket, wondering if warmth and discomfort can ever truly be separated. There's one quirky custom noted in certain armies: men stuffing their boots or helmets with straw to use as pillows. The absurdity of it makes you smile in the dark. A hardened leather boot, now cradling your head like a cradle. Yet, when you've spent days with nothing soft, even that lumpy, uneven cushion feels like luxury. Some tied extra tunics into knots, resting their heads on the bundled fabric, while others simply folded their arms under their cheek and surrendered to the hardness. Soldiers weren't picky. Sleep itself was the treasure, not the shape of the bed. And here again, scholars argue, was straw truly so common in every campaign? Was it distributed evenly, or hoarded by those who could pay for it? Some evidence suggests entire armies ran out quickly, leaving men to rot on bare ground for weeks at a time. Others point to requisition lists, showing straw ordered by the wagon load, meant to refresh the bedding nightly. The truth probably lies in between, sometimes abundant, sometimes scarce, depending on the campaign, the commander, and sheer luck. You, Lying now on your own thin layer, don't care much for the debate. You feel each stalk beneath you, rough and awkward, but you cling to it anyway, because without it, the cold earth would steal every ounce of your strength. So you settle finally into your palate. It's scratchy, it smells, it leaves you itching in places you'd rather not mention. But slowly, as your eyes close and your breath deepens, you realize it does its job. It lifts you just far enough from the earth to remind you that, for tonight, you're still alive. And in a world where even rest can be an enemy, that inch of straw between you and the ground feels almost like mercy. The straw beneath you crackles when you shift, and the blanket itches more than it soothes, but none of that gnaws at you, quite like the indecision over your boots. You lie there, staring at the faint outline of canvas above, listening to the snores and coughs of the men pressed against you, and the thought returns again and again. Do you take them off or keep them on? It's absurd how such a small choice can feel like a life or death gamble. The boots are heavy, stiff from days of marching through mud and rain, caked with filth that clings stubbornly even after you tried scraping them against a rock. They reek, of course, an odor sharp enough to sour the already foul air of the tent. Yet they also guard the most vulnerable part of you, your feet. Expose them now, and you may not get them back in the morning. Every soldier has an opinion. One man insists you should never, under any circumstances, remove boots in the field. He swears he saw comrades wait with toes blackened by frost, their bare feet too numb to lace up again, doomed before the march even began. Another scoffs at the idea, tugging his own boots free with a groan of relief, claiming that to sleep in them is to invite rot, blisters festering until they smell worse than any corpse. You listen to both arguments, torn, because each carries truth, and neither offers comfort. In truth, medieval armies wrestled with this dilemma constantly. Chroniclers describe soldiers trudging barefoot across summer fields, but in winter campaigns, boots became lifelines. They were often crude, stitched from thick leather, lined with fur if you were lucky, or stuffed with straw if you weren't. They soaked through quickly, the seams never quite tight enough to keep water out, and once, wet, they froze stiff by nightfall. Some men stuffed them with hot stones from the fire, wrapped in cloth before bed, only to find the heat faded before their eyelids closed. Others lined them with moss or wool scraps, hoping the added padding would keep numbness at bay. For every trick, there was another failure. It isn't just about comfort, though. Boots are armor in their own right. Without them, your feet are prey to stones, ice, and filth. Remove them at night, and there's the risk they'll be stolen, whether by a desperate comrade or a prowling camp follower with an eye for resale. Imagine waking at dawn to find yourself barefoot in the snow, the army already mustering for march. You'd be left behind before you could plead your case. So many soldiers slept with boots tied to their ankles, or with straps knotted around their legs to ensure they couldn't slip away unnoticed. The paranoia of theft mixed with the dread of frostbite until no choice felt safe. And yet, the allure of bare feet is strong. After miles of marching, your toes throb inside their prison, nails bruised, skin rubbed raw. To tug the boots free, to stretch out your feet and feel the air against them, that is bliss, even if the air is cold. Men joked that the groan a soldier made when removing his boots at night was louder than any battle cry. The relief, however short-lived, was worth the risk. Some even dangled their feet near the tent's draft on purpose, believing that exposure hardened them, toughened the skin, made the morning less cruel. Whether it helped or harmed is anyone's guess, but the ritual became a badge of endurance, like daring the night to do its worst. Here, the historians cannot quite agree. Some argue that men generally remove boots whenever possible, prioritizing the chance to dry them by the fire or at least let the skin breathe. Others counter that sources exaggerate this, that the reality of winter warfare forced most soldiers to keep them on, no matter how foul the smell or how blistered the flesh. The accounts are contradictory, one army described as barefoot by choice, another as shackled to their boots by necessity. The truth may never be cleanly settled, lost somewhere in the mud between exaggeration and lived misery. There are quirks too. hidden in the tales of campaign life. In certain Germanic regions, soldiers stuffed garlic skins into their boots, convinced it kept frost from settling in their toes. Others swore by urine, soaking wool scraps and wrapping them around feet before sliding them into shoes. A foul but strangely popular method. The stench alone must have been enough to clear space in the tent, though perhaps that was part of the appeal. In contrast, wealthier knights padded their footwear with fur, sometimes trimmed so finely it would look at home in a noble hall. You, of course, get none of that. Just the question, off or on? Tonight, you hesitate. You reach for the laces, fingers fumbling in the dark, only to stop midway. The snoring on your left reminds you that if you pull them free, your neighbor will curse, the smell and shove you away, robbing you of what little warmth his shoulder offers. But the ache in your feet is sharp, begging for release. At last, you compromise, tugging one boot halfway down, letting the cool air lick at your ankle while the rest of your foot remains caged. It's a foolish solution, but then so is this war, and so is this night. You lie back, eyes closing, boots awkwardly in place, wondering if you'll wait grateful for the choice. Or not at all. You tug your cloak tighter around your shoulders, and suddenly its weight feels like the most important possession you own. Out here, where the tent walls flutter and sigh with every gust, where your straw bedding grows damp no matter how carefully, you laid it down, the cloak becomes more than clothing. It is shield, blanket, pillow, and sometimes even makeshift door flap. Without it, you are naked before the cold. With it, you are at least pretending to have a chance. Soldiers have always understood this strange duality. A cloak is not just something you wear by day, it is the companion that follows you into sleep. You can smell the wool, faintly oily, still holding the lanolin of the sheep from which it was sheared. It has been your constant shadow, soaked with rain on the march, stiffened by frost in the morning, streaked with mud where it dragged across the ground. Yet now, in the hush of the tent, you wrap it around your body like a cocoon, and its roughness becomes a comfort. The fibers itch, yes, but they trap the air close, and in a night like this, that's enough to keep the shivering at bay. You pull the hood forward, covering your face, and it's almost as though you've built a tiny room inside the larger one, a private space made of wool and breath. Cloaks were standard issue for armies across medieval Europe, as essential as any, spear or helmet. Chroniclers note them as part of the basic kit. A length of wool, sometimes dyed with cheap madder to a dull red, or left the natural grey of sheep's fleece. Some were lined with fur, fox or rabbit if the soldier was fortunate, squirrel if his lord had deeper coffers. Wealthy knights wore them long and flowing, trimmed with embroidery that declared their status, while common men draped whatever patch of fabric they had, a garment as practical as it was plain. Cloaks doubled as tents when no tents could be pitched, stretched over poles or branches to form a crude lean-to. Even the poorest soldier could make one into a roof, a wall, or a blanket. They were survival stitched into fabric. But cloaks were not always about warmth. In certain campaigns, soldiers used them to hide their movements, draping them over shields to mask glints of metal, or wrapping them around bundles of supplies so that enemies wouldn't spot valuables at a distance. One curious story tells of men tying their cloaks to horses' tails, letting them drag across the ground to kick up dust and make the army seem larger than it was. Another has a soldier laying his cloak across frozen ground to walk across without slipping, his very own woolen bridge. These may sound like small acts, even ridiculous. But when everything around you tries to kill you, you learn to use whatever is at hand. Now, inside the tent, the cloak is your armor against the night. You fold it once, twice, pulling it over. Your boots, tucking the edges beneath your body as though sewing yourself shut. The man beside you does the same, his cloak overlapping yours until you both share the warmth. There is no shame in it. Soldiers huddle close, cloaks draped across shoulders like wings, a mass of wool and breath that blurs the line between bodies. The air inside grows thick, damp with condensation, but it's warmer than the world outside. The cloak makes intimacy unavoidable, binding strangers together under the same wool. Still, there is debate among historians over how effective cloaks truly were. Some argue that without modern waterproofing, they soaked through too easily to offer real warmth, becoming heavy, clammy burdens. Others point to accounts of soldiers praising their cloaks as lifelines, swearing they could not have endured campaigns without them. Perhaps the truth lies in the middle. A cloak was only as good as the man who wore it and the conditions he faced. If kept dry, it was salvation. If soaked, it was misery stitched into every thread. Tonight, yours is dry enough to make the difference, and that's all that matters. There's an odd quirk, too, in how cloaks became markers of identity. Some armies dyed them in uniform colours, red for the English in certain periods, white crosses stitched onto darker wool for crusaders marching east. Others left them plain, indistinguishable from any peasant's garment. But soldiers often added personal touches. A patch of fabric from home sewn into the lining, a small charm tied to the clasp, even a stitched symbol that only they understood. In the half-dark of the tent, you can see such marks glimmer faintly in the firelight. Thread that shines a little brighter, a brooch polished smoother than the rest. Each cloak carries its own story, its own little rebellion against the sameness of army life. You roll onto your side, clutching the fabric closer, and realize that this single piece of cloth is all that stands between you and the void of the night. Outside, the wind winds across the camp, rattling shields and snapping banners. Somewhere, a horse stamps, sending up sparks as its hoof strikes stone. A sentry coughs, and the sound is quickly swallowed by the dark. Inside, the only sound is the soft shuffle of cloaks being adjusted, drawn tighter, wrapped closer. Sleep will not come easily, but without this woolen guardian, it would not come at all. You breathe in, exhale, and let the cloak press its warmth back against you. For a moment, you almost believe you are safe, almost believe the cold has been banished. In truth, it lingers, waiting patiently outside the folds, ready to creep in if you let the cloak slip. So you grip it tighter, close your eyes, and let the night move on, carried not by comfort, but by the stubborn determination of wool and will. The night drags on, and though the cloak tight around your shoulders keeps some of the chill from gnawing too deep, the true heart of warmth, the fire, is somewhere out there, glowing faintly beyond the flap of canvas. You can smell it, smoke heavy with resin, sparks snapping like insects in the air. It should be a comfort, a reminder of hearth and home. But here in camp, fire is as much danger as it is salvation. You lie awake, half listening, half drowsing, knowing well why flames are kept far from the tents. One stray ember, carried on. The wind could turn your fragile shelter into a coffin in seconds. You picture the bonfires burning outside, circles of men huddled close around them, faces lit in orange, eyes hollow with fatigue. They stretch their hands out until the skin prickles, then draw them back, repeating the ritual endlessly, chasing warmth they can never quite keep. The fires are spaced carefully, distant enough from the canvas city of tents to avoid disaster, yet near enough that the glow washes faintly across the camp, painting shadows that flicker along the guy ropes. Commanders know too well the price of carelessness. Chronicles tell of whole encampments destroyed in the dark, one tent catching and then another, flames racing faster than men could shout, soldiers stumbling out barefoot and weaponless into the night. Fire is a fickle ally. You crave its heat, but you keep it at arm's length, like a friend who cannot be trusted. Inside, the absence of flame is keenly felt. The air grows clammy, condensation dripping down the canvas like cold sweat. You hear a man mutter in his sleep, teeth chattering even under layers of cloak and blanket. The ground seems to leach warmth from every body, dragging it down into the earth. You long to drag a brazier in here, even a small one, just enough to take the edge off. Some armies did exactly that. Iron pots filled with coals carried into tents and set in the center. But everyone knew the risk. One careless kick, One shift in the straw bedding, and the whole tent could go up in smoke. There are stories of men asphyxiated too, the smoke filling the enclosed space, stealing breath while they slept unaware. And so, commanders forbade it more often than not, leaving soldiers to dream of warmth they could never risk. Still, men are inventive when survival is at stake. In some campaigns, soldiers buried hot stones in the earth beneath their tents, laying cloaks atop them, the heat radiating upward for a few precious hours. Others carried small clay vessels, heated near the fire, tucked under cloaks like crude hot water bottles. There's even mention of soldiers clutching half-burnt logs wrapped in rags, falling asleep with the embers pressed against their chests, waking with scorch marks on their tunics but alive all the same. The ingenuity borders on madness, and yet you can almost understand it. The line between warmth and cold is thin enough that even desperation feels like logic. And then there are the rituals, the almost superstitious care with which fire was tended. No soldier wanted to be the one whose negligence set the camp ablaze. Fires were built in pits, circled with stones, sometimes dampened with green wood, so they smouldered more than they blazed. Watchmen were assigned, their job not only to guard against ambush, but to keep the fire fed. Not too high, not too low. You imagine one of them now, stamping his feet in the frost, eyes stinging with smoke as he pokes at the embers, muttering under his breath. The whole camp depends on his vigilance, though most will never notice him. He is guardian of warmth, guardian of safety, yet he will slip back into his tent at dawn, as unnoticed as any shadow. Historians, for their part, are divided on just how strictly fire was controlled. Some accounts describe disciplined encampments where flames were regulated to the smallest detail, while others paint a more chaotic picture, men lighting small personal fires wherever they pleased, sparks flying dangerously close to canvas walls. Perhaps both are true, depending on the army, the commander, the season. But the fear of fire, the knowledge of how easily it could turn a camp into ashes, haunted every soldier. You feel it even now, lying in the dark, the desire to reach out for heat and the fear that touching it will destroy you. One odd anecdote drifts through your mind, half remembered from a tale told by a grinning veteran. Soldiers warming themselves, not by sitting near the fire, but by burying their feet in the ash once it cooled, the warmth lingering long after the flames died. You can almost picture them, rows of men with soot-stained toes, laughing at the absurdity even as they sighed with relief. It's a strange image, but perhaps that strangeness kept them sane. When life shrinks to cold and hunger, even ashes become treasure. You roll onto your side, tucking the cloak tighter, the faint glow of the bonfire seeping through the slit in the canvas. Outside, laughter rises, harsh and brittle, quickly swallowed by the wind. Sparks drift upward, lost to the night sky. Inside, your breath mists against the wool pulled over your face, warm for now, though fleeting. Fire is close enough to smell, close enough to see, but never close enough to share. And so, you lie there in the uneasy truce between safety and comfort, knowing that warmth has been left deliberately out of reach, and sleep will come only if exhaustion smothers the cold. Before the cold smothers you, the fire outside pops and hisses, but inside the tent the only warmth you feel comes not from flame, but from the press of bodies around you. It is strange to think that survival, at its most basic, is reduced to this: flesh against flesh, breath shared in the dark, the mingling of strangers who might have cursed one another during the day, now leaning close out of necessity. The cold is merciless, a creeping thing that seeps through canvas and straw, and the only defense left when wool and cloaks fail is the human body itself. You notice how the men shift, instinctively drawing nearer, shoulders touching, knees knocking. At first, the closeness is awkward, an intrusion on whatever sense of privacy a soldier pretends to keep. But little by little, the discomfort eases, replaced by a fragile sense of unity. The warmth spreading across your arm from the man beside. You is not affection, not friendship. It is biology turned into mercy. You know he feels the same from you, though neither of you will ever say it. Pride has no place in this dance. You huddle together because the night demands it. Accounts of medieval campaigns make no secret of this practice. Chroniclers describe soldiers pressed together under a single cloak, piled like logs in the smallest tents, their collective heat the only thing keeping death at bay. It was not limited to common infantry either. Knights too, for all their silks and furs, often shared bedding with squires or comrades. A single body cannot always outlast the frost, but several bodies together create a furnace that no storm can fully quench. Even horses tethered nearby were sometimes pulled close to tents so that their breath might seep inside, warming the air by a degree or two. Imagine that, the mighty warhorse, charger of battlefields, reduced to little more than a living stove for the men it carried. And then there is the snoring, the groaning, the restless turning. No warmth comes without noise. You close your eyes and hear a symphony of sound. Someone grinding his teeth, someone muttering through a dream, someone's stomach growling with hunger so loud it startles him awake. One man exhales with a whistle, through his nose, high and shrill like a kettle boiling over. Another coughs, wet and persistent, a reminder that sickness always hovers near. Sleep in this chorus is fragmented, uneasy, but at least the air is warmer. The mind learns to take what it can. There is one curious practice you remember being told of. In the coldest campaigns, men would deliberately align themselves in patterns, lying head to toe so that every man's breath warmed another's feet. The arrangement looked ridiculous, a zigzag of bodies across the straw, but it worked. Toes stayed less numb, and faces avoided the full blast of another man's snore. Was it common? That's less clear. Some historians argue that these stories were exaggerations, campfire humor turned into pseudo-truth, while others insist that such arrangements were too practical not to have been tried. You, lying with a knee against your ribs and someone's breath tickling your ear, almost wish they'd organized themselves more thoughtfully. The closeness bred quirks of its own. Men told stories to pass the time before sleep, whispering of battles past, of sweethearts waiting at home, of ghosts said to stalk old fields. Sometimes laughter rose, sharp and sudden, startling those already drifting. Other times the whispers turned solemn, a prayer murmured into the darkness, answered by a chorus of amens. But just as often, arguments erupted, elbows shoved too hard, a cloak pulled too far, one man's bulk crushing another's straw pallet. The tension of the day spilled into the night, and the tent became as much battlefield as refuge. Yet eventually, exhaustion always won. Bodies stilled, breathing steadied, and the tent became a hive of shared warmth, fragile peace bought with shivers. Historians still debate whether soldiers grew accustomed to this intimacy or resented it to the end. Some argue that the bonds, formed in such conditions, forged camaraderie stronger than any oath, that the act of sleeping together in hardship made brothers out of strangers. Others suggest the opposite, that the enforced closeness bred more irritation than loyalty, that men longed for distance even more than rest. Perhaps it was both at once, resentment in the moment, nostalgia in memory. The human mind has a way of polishing suffering into stories worth telling. And then there were the unlucky nights when even huddling wasn't enough. When the frost sank too deep, when the wind howled too cruelly, men woke stiff and silent, bodies pressed as close as they could manage, but still robbed of warmth. In those moments, survival itself seemed arbitrary. You could be the one who shivered through to dawn, or the one who didn't rise when the horn blew. The difference might only be the thickness of a cloak, the generosity of a neighbor pulling his wool across your shoulder, or the stubborn will of your own heart. You pull the cloak tighter, press closer to the warmth on either side, and let your breath mingle with theirs. It is not friendship, it is not love, but it is survival, and that is enough. You close your eyes, ears still full of snores and coughs, and hope the combined furnace of weary men will carry you through until the first pale crack of dawn. You have just begun to sink into that shallow, fragile state of half-sleep, the one where the body sags against straw and cloaks, but the mind still twitches awake at every creak. When a hand grips your shoulder and shakes you hard enough to pull you back to the present. It's your turn for guard duty. You don't need words. The look in your comrade's eyes says it all. Resentment that he had to wake you. Relief that it's no longer his burden. He collapses into your still warm patch, without hesitation, already dragging the cloak over his face. And so you rise, fumbling, cursing softly, every joint stiff as you try to remember that the camp doesn't sleep, even if you want to. The rhythm of a medieval night is never one of uninterrupted rest. Armies could not afford it. Too many dangers lurked in the dark. Raiders creeping silently toward the camp. Spies prowling to count tents and fires. Thieves sneaking in to strip soldiers of weapons or horses. To sleep through the night would be to invite disaster. And so, watches were divided. Men pulled from their fragile nests of straw to pace the perimeter with eyes heavy, hands numb, and swords close to useless from exhaustion. You feel it in your own body now as you tug your cloak tighter, stumbling into the cold, the fire's glow brushing your face for the briefest, teasing moment before you pass into shadow. Guard duty is misery. The cold feels sharper once you've left the huddle of the tent, like knives pressed along every nerve. Your boots crunch on frozen soil, and every step sends a tremor of pain through your blistered feet. The camp spreads around you in uneven lines, tents sagging in the moonlight, smoke drifting low and heavy. Shapes move inside, men shifting, coughing, rolling over in sleep. But out here, you are utterly alone. Every rustle in the grass becomes a threat. Every creak of canvas a whisper of danger. You grip your spear tighter, though you know if an enemy appeared now, your sluggish limbs would struggle to react. Sleep has been stolen from you, and in its place is vigilance, fragile and thin. The cycle repeats across armies of every age. A horn or bell might mark the change of watch, though more often it was a simple shake of the shoulder. One weary man trading misery with another. There were no favors here. Everyone bore the burden eventually. Knights might complain, claiming rank exempted them, but commanders knew that idle guards were dangerous guards, and sometimes even the proud found themselves stumbling along the line with cloak pulled tight and sword rattling in its scabbard. There are records of strict punishment for men who slept on duty, lashes, fines, even death in the harshest campaigns. For if one man dozed, the entire camp paid the price. Still, humanity slipped in. There's a story of soldiers on watch in a French campaign who passed the hours by carving little figures from spare wood, whittling shapes of animals or saints by the faint light of the fire. Another tale tells of men singing softly, low chants that blurred into the night air, half prayer, half lullaby, as much to keep themselves awake as to comfort the men listening from tents. You can almost hear it now, the quiet hum, the murmur, of voices rising just enough to remind everyone they weren't entirely alone. Perhaps the song was out of tune, perhaps the words were slurred with fatigue, but it carried warmth the fire could not. Yet here too, historians find disagreement. Some argue that guard rotations were rigorous, enforced with precision, each man taking his turn in measured intervals. Others suggest the reality was far looser, that men bribed or begged their way out of duty, leaving weaker comrades to shoulder the burden. The truth likely varied. Disciplined armies clinging to order, ragged bands slipping into chaos. But the universal constant was the disruption it caused. No man slept deeply, for every man knew his shoulder might be shaken before long. Sleep came in fragments, never in peace. You returned to your tent hours later, eyes burning, fingers stiff. The flap closes behind you, and instantly you are swallowed by warmth and stink, the mingled breath of the men who never left their bedding. You fumble your way back to your patch, half kicking someone's leg, half collapsing onto the straw. The warmth is there, but it feels foreign now, almost mocking after the night's chill. You curl in on yourself, desperate for rest, but dawn is already a pale smudge along the horizon. The horn will sound soon, calling the camp back to march, and you realize the cruel truth. You've lost more sleep than you've gained. So it goes. night after night. The body never truly rests, only stumbles forward in snatches of stolen minutes. You might dream briefly, only to be pulled back by the sound of footsteps outside, or by the shake of another man demanding you take his place. Sleep is not refuge. Here, it is ration, measured out by duty, interrupted by vigilance, traded like coin between men equally desperate. And as you finally sink into that shallow fog of exhaustion, the thought lingers. The greatest enemy is not always the one with a sword. Sometimes it is the simple denial of rest. You collapse back into the straw, half numb from the cold of guard duty. But no sooner do you curl into yourself than your hand brushes something solid. Instinct makes you jolt, only to realize it isn't another man's knee or elbow. It's the hilt of your own sword. Of course it is. In this world, sleep and steel are never far apart. Every soldier, no matter his rank, knows better than to put distance between his body and his weapon. A tent may keep the wind out, a cloak may hold, in warmth, but only a sword or spear within arm's reach keeps you alive when danger arrives before dawn. You draw it a little closer, settling your hand against the familiar grip, and try to ignore the way it reminds you that peace here is never more than half real. Weapons in camp are more than tools of war. They are pillows, props, and guardians. Some men rest with their spears laid along their sides, the shaft doubling as both bedfellow and barrier. Others tuck daggers beneath their cloaks, pressing the cold iron against their ribs, comforting in its steadiness even if it bruises in. The night. You can picture a man sleeping with his shield across his chest, arms wrapped around it as though embracing a lover. The image is almost comical, yet utterly practical. If an alarm sounded, if the flap of the tent was torn open by enemies or thieves, no one wanted to fumble in the dark. To be unarmed for even a moment could mean death. Chroniclers describe this habit across countless campaigns. During the 100 Years' War, soldiers were said to sleep with swords already belted, ready to stumble from their tents at a moment's notice. In crusading armies, spears leaned against the canvas walls, their tips glinting faintly in torchlight, so that every man could snatch his weapon without thought. Even in the quieter moments of garrison duty, weapons were part of the nightly ritual, placed as carefully as blankets, the presence of steel as necessary as straw. To fight all day and then lay your weapon aside felt almost obscene, like stripping off a part of yourself. And yet, the intimacy between man and weapon carried its own quirks. Some soldiers named their swords, whispering the names as they drifted, to sleep, as though the blade itself were a companion who stood watch while they slumbered. Others etched charms into hilts or tucked relics into scabbards, believing the steel would inherit the blessing. There is even an odd tale of a band of soldiers who, too poor for proper bedding, used their shields as mattresses, laying flat on the curved wood, swearing it kept them off the damp earth. You imagine the tent, half filled with men balancing, awkwardly, on their own shields, and almost laugh despite the cold. Necessity has always made comedians of soldiers. Still, there are disagreements about how much trust soldiers truly placed in this ritual. Some historians argue that the accounts of men never parting from their weapons are exaggerated, romanticized by chroniclers eager to paint soldiers as ever-ready, iron-willed warriors. Surely, they say, exhaustion sometimes won, and weapons were pushed aside in favor of comfort. Others counter that the evidence is consistent. Armies drilled vigilance into their men, and even in sleep, the discipline lingered. The truth is likely a blur between duty and fatigue. You can feel that tension yourself as you rest one hand on your sword's hilt, the other tugging your cloak tighter. You want to believe you'll leap awake at the first alarm, but you also know the weight of exhaustion can make even iron slip from your grasp. The presence of weapons shapes the tent itself. Space is already cramped, but with blades and shields scattered everywhere, the risk of injury is constant. You shift in the dark and scrape your calf against a spearhead. Someone else turns too quickly and clinks his helmet against another's sword pommel. The noise is maddening, metallic, a reminder that sleep here is always fragile. And yet, no one dares complain. To suggest moving weapons outside is to invite ridicule, or worse, suspicion that you value comfort over readiness. Better a bruise from your neighbor's dagger than the shame of being caught unarmed in the night. The psychological weight of steel is undeniable. With your sword at your side, you feel a little safer, as though its presence alone wards off danger. Without it, you'd feel naked, exposed, less than a soldier. The weapon becomes more than a tool. It becomes identity, reassurance, and prison all at once. You close your eyes, fingers brushing the hilt, and tell yourself it is enough to keep nightmares away. But in the dark, when every creak of canvas feels like an intruder's hand, you wonder whether the weapon is truly a shield, or merely a reminder of how fragile your safety really is. And so you sleep, if it can be called sleep, with steel pressed close, body curled tight, one hand gripping the promise of survival. Outside, the camp murmurs with distant sounds, but inside, you surrender to exhaustion. The sword rests with you, a silent companion in the straw, waiting to wake with you at the next alarm, or perhaps not at all. The sword rests under your hand, but even its cold reassurance cannot shield you from the relentless noise of camp life. You try to close your eyes again, to slip back into that thin veil of half sleep, but the sounds seep through canvas, as if the walls were nothing more than a spider's web. There is no such thing as silence in a medieval encampment. Night may dim the light, but it does not still the world. You lie there, eyes shut, and let the noises wash over you like waves, each one dragging you farther from rest. First comes the chorus of men inside the tent. Snoring, of course, loud and varied, each soldier producing his own peculiar rhythm. One rattles through his nose like a broken bellows. Another hums with each exhale. Yet another saws the air so violently you're sure he'll suffocate before dawn. In between snores come the coughs, wet, rattling, the kind that spray dampness into the air. Someone mutters in his sleep, words you can't quite catch but which sound like a plea. Another man twitches, kicking out against the straw, and the entire floor rustles beneath the group like an animal shifting in its den. The tent is a hive, never still, never silent. Then the noises outside creep in. Horses stamping in the mud, their tails swishing, their nostrils flaring in sharp, breathy bursts. A mule brays suddenly, high-pitched and grating, as if mocking your attempt at rest. Harnesses clink faintly, the shifting of leather and iron as animals shuffle. From the fires comes laughter, the kind of laughter that is too loud, too raw, fueled by whatever ale or wine someone managed to sneak along. It rises, cracks, then collapses into argument. Voices slurred but sharp. You imagine fists being thrown, someone dragged back by his comrades. The quarrel swallowed by the night, only to flare again an hour later. Somewhere in the distance you hear the metallic ring of weapons. Two men sparring despite the hour, or perhaps merely showing off. The sound is reckless, and you can feel the irritation of nearby tents vibrating in curses muttered under breath. But what can anyone do? Discipline frays in the dark. Men are restless, and restlessness rarely ends. Quietly. The sounds don't stop with men or beasts. Dogs bark, sometimes in alarm, sometimes simply because they too feel the tension of the camp. Their yelps ripple outward, setting others off until the chorus of barks feels louder than the horn that will call you to march. The wind adds its own note, whistling through guy ropes, slapping the canvas so hard you half expect the tent to lift from the ground. Rain, when it falls, is even worse, drumming endlessly on the roof, dripping through seams, plopping onto faces already turned toward uneasy dreams. You roll onto your side, pressing the cloak against your ears, but it's useless. The sounds are inside you now, stitched into the air of the camp. Sleep here is not a gentle drifting. It is a wrestling match with noise. You envy the men who can drop into slumber in an instant, who snore obliviously through every clamor. They are either blessed or cursed. You cannot decide which. Chroniclers mention this constant unrest, describing encampments that sounded more like villages than barracks. Thousands of men, hundreds of animals, fires burning, tools clattering. Such noise could not simply vanish with the setting sun. One writer compared it to sleeping in the middle of a marketplace, another to trying to nap beside a forge. Some even suggest commanders encouraged the din, believing that noisy camps gave the impression of strength, making enemies wary of approaching. Whether that was true or not, it certainly meant soldiers themselves found little peace. Amid this, cacophony are oddities that only grow stranger the longer you listen. Someone plays a flute, thin and reedy, its tune winding through the camp like smoke. It's badly played, halting and uneven, yet oddly comforting, a scrap of melody rising above the snores and coughs. Another man somewhere recites verses, his voice low and solemn, perhaps scripture, perhaps a bawdy rhyme too muffled to catch. There is even the occasional burst of animal mimicry, a soldier braying like a donkey or clucking like a hen, to the amusement of his companions. It's ridiculous, childish even, but when boredom gnaws and darkness presses in, any sound is fair game. Here too scholars argue over how oppressive these noises really were. Some claim soldiers simply adapted, their bodies so worn from marching and fighting that they could sleep through anything. Others believe the unrest of night added to the exhaustion of campaigns, that lack of proper sleep broke men down as surely as hunger or wounds. The truth, perhaps, is that both were real. Some men snored through the chaos, others lay awake like you now, cursing every cough and bark. You sigh, shift again, and let the noise roll over you. There is no fighting it. The camp is alive, restless, full of voices that refuse to be hushed. Sleep will come, but not because the world grows quiet. It will come because your body finally surrenders, battered into stillness by fatigue greater than irritation. Until then, you listen to the horses, the laughter, the endless snores, and remind yourself that tomorrow, when dawn rises and horns sound, everyone will pretend they slept well enough. The noises of camp have worn you thin, a constant reminder that sleep is never simple here. But the real cruelty of the night comes with the weather. Tonight the air feels heavy, damp, and sharp against your skin. The kind of chill that seeps through wool, through straw, through flesh itself. Winter on campaign is misery distilled into every breath. The tent sags under the weight of sleet, the ropes groan, and the ground beneath you hardens into a frozen slab. You can shift all you like, curl into a tighter ball, or bury yourself beneath cloak and blanket. But the cold is clever. It finds its way in through every gap, settling in your bones like an unwelcome tenant. You remember the stories you heard, before the march, of men dying not from blade or arrow, but from frost. Entire companies reduced in number not by the clash of battle, but by the steady hunger of winter. Men too stiff to rise at dawn, their bodies frozen in the positions they had chosen for sleep. There is nothing dramatic about such deaths, nothing glorious, just silence when the horn sounds, a man's shoulder unmoving when shaken. Chroniclers record these losses with a kind of detached pity, as if to say, this is the cost of marching in winter, nothing more. And yet for the men lying in the dark, each gust of wind feels like a hand testing whether it can claim you next. The tent itself is no fortress. In rain it leaks, in snow it buckles. Meltwater drips from seams, plopping onto your forehead, soaking your bedding, until even the straw beneath you squelches with every shift. You roll to one side only to find the ground damp, roll back and discover the same. The smell of wet wool and mildew fills your nose, choking more than the smoke from the fires outside. You wonder briefly if the men who designed these tents ever slept in them themselves. Desperate measures appear in such nights. Men cram tighter together, not caring if knees dig into backs or cloaks tangle into one indistinguishable heap. A few curse loudly, swearing they'd rather risk a frozen watch outside by the fire than rot in damp wool within. Others tuck their heads beneath cloaks, creating tiny caves of breath, air warm and stale, but better than the open draft. There's even the tale of men burying themselves in snow to sleep. Counterintuitive, perhaps, but snow insulates, trapping warmth in a way the open air will not. You imagine them curled in white mounds, indistinguishable from the landscape, sleeping like foxes in their burrows. It sounds mad, and yet, perhaps it worked. Horses, too, become part of the struggle. Brought close to tents, their bodies radiate heat, steam rising from their backs into the night air. Some soldiers press themselves against the animals' flanks, borrowing warmth as shamelessly as they borrow it from each other. There's a strange intimacy in it. Man and beast, bound together by the same enemy. The horse exhales, the soldier exhales, and their breath mingles, mist in the cold. You'd laugh at the absurdity if your jaw weren't already stiff from shivering. And through it all, commanders drive the men on. Campaigns did not halt for snow unless absolutely forced. The annals of history are full of armies trudging through, frozen passes, sleet cutting at their faces, tents pitched in valleys where cold air pooled like poison. Some nights the men were lucky to sleep at all, standing watch with weapons in hand, too stiff to crouch on frozen ground. Chroniclers tell of the Burgundian army shivering through winter campaigns, of English archers waking to find their bowstrings frozen stiff, of crusaders in the Levant discovering that desert nights could chill the marrow as brutally as any alpine pass. Winter was an enemy that knew no allegiance. Among historians, there is a debate that still stirs. Were these soldiers equipped at all for the conditions they faced, or were they consistently sent into climates with no thought for their survival? Some argue that commanders understood the risks, that supplies of cloaks, furs, and firewood were carefully planned but simply overwhelmed by circumstance. Others claim negligence, that men were sacrificed not to strategy but to the arrogance of leaders who underestimated nature. The truth is hard to untangle. Armies, vast and unwieldy, consumed resources faster than they could be gathered. Even the best plans collapse beneath the weight of thousands of shivering bodies. And still, in the midst of all this, men found ways to endure. One chronicler describes soldiers laying heated stones beneath their cloaks, pulling them tight until the warmth faded, then shuffling to the fires to fetch more. Another tells of woolen caps pulled low, mittens improvised from scraps of cloth, even socks fashioned from strips of linen. You can almost see them, a tent filled with men cocooned in strange patchworks of fabric, each one inventing his own defense against the cold. These little acts of ingenuity were not glamorous, but they carried men through nights when survival seemed doubtful. You pull your cloak tighter now, tucking your feet beneath you, curling until you feel as small as possible. Around you, the tent sighs under the burden of snow, and the men groan in their sleep, muttering, coughing, shifting endlessly. Your fingers are numb, your breath fogs the air before your face, and you wonder if dawn will ever come. Winter is patient, and it does not tire. You cling to the warmth of the bodies beside you, the scratch of straw beneath, the heavy wool over your shoulders, and you tell yourself it is enough. Perhaps it is. For though the cold presses close, though the night stretches long, men have always found ways to outlast even winter's cruelty. One shiver, one breath, one heartbeat at a time. The cruelest truth of the soldier's life is that winter is not the only enemy. For every night you curse the ice creeping into your bones, there comes a season when the cold gives way to a suffocating heat, and suddenly the tent transforms from a frozen cage into a stifling oven. Summer on campaign is its own kind of misery. You lie on your back in the tent, wool cloak tossed aside, shirt clinging with sweat, and the air feels thick, unmoving, heavy as a blanket pressed over your face. Instead of shivering, you swelter. Instead of frost creeping under the canvas, you feel heat trapped inside, radiating back at you like a punishment. The body has no mercy in either season. Cold freezes you still. Heat wrings you out until you are limp and gasping. The tent itself does not help. Canvas, that rough wool or hemp, traps heat almost as efficiently as it keeps out wind. By day it soaks in sunlight until the fibers are hot to the touch, and by night it releases that heat slowly, suffocating those within. You try to prop the flap open to coax in a breeze, But every soldier has the same idea. The tent becomes a funnel of foul air, sweat, unwashed bodies, the stink of leather boots fermenting in the corner. All of it swirling together until you gag with each breath. You roll onto your side, pressing your face against the canvas, hoping for some whisper of coolness. The canvas is warm too, sticky with condensation from the bodies pressed within. This is when the insects come. Fleas and lice thrive in the folds of wool, biting mercilessly through the night, leaving you itching until your skin is raw. You swat at them in the dark, cursing, but the relief never lasts. In warmer regions, southern France, Spain, or the Levant, flies buzz endlessly, landing on faces, crawling into mouths, never relenting. Mosquitoes hum, biting through thin linen, leaving welts that swell and itch. The noise of snoring you could almost forgive. But the endless whine of insects is torture. You tug your cloak back over your head despite the heat, suffocating yourself in stale air simply to escape the crawling, buzzing torment. It is almost laughable how inventive men became in their desperation. Soldiers rubbed garlic onto their skin, believing the pungent smell drove insects away. Others smeared mud across their arms and legs, drying into a crude second skin that masked the scent of sweat. There is even a tale of men scattering ashes over their bedding, lying in grey dust like corpses because it discouraged fleas. You picture the scene. A tent full of ash-streaked soldiers, coughing and sneezing, yet scratching a little less. It is absurd, yes, but perhaps no more absurd than freezing yourself in snow for warmth. Survival often looks foolish to anyone who isn't the one trying to survive. Heat also breeds restlessness. Men toss and turn, unable to sink into proper sleep. Shirts are pulled off, hose rolled down, but decency is never fully abandoned. No one wants to wake to find himself exposed among comrades. And yet, half-naked soldiers crowd together, each seeking space that does not exist. Elbows jab, feet press against thighs, every movement another irritation. The tent becomes a swamp of frustration, curses muttered under breath, swats and shoves exchanged in the dark. A man's sweat is his own burden by day, but by night it becomes everyone else's misery. The food only worsens the discomfort. Rations spoil quickly in the heat. Meat salted and dried turns rancid. Bread molds, wine sours. You fall asleep hungry, stomach aching, and wake no better. Water is never clean, drawn from rivers muddied by horses. So men drink warm ale that only fuels their thirst. There are records of soldiers waking in the night, stumbling half-conscious to latrines, their bellies rebelling against food gone, foul. The air of the camp grows thick with sickness, the heat amplifying every stench. And yet, for all this, some found ways to endure. Chroniclers describe men sleeping outdoors in summer, abandoning tents altogether, spreading cloaks under the stars. They claimed the night sky offered cooler air, the breeze kept insects away, and the open space was worth the risk of dewfall or sudden storms. Others, less fortunate, sweltered in canvas, trapped by duty or fear. Here historians argue again, were tents abandoned in heat as often as sources suggest? Or were such accounts romantic exaggerations? Some evidence points to tents as the constant refuge, no matter the discomfort, while other reports insist that soldiers sought freedom under the sky whenever they dared. Perhaps both are true, depending on commander season and the men themselves. You lie there now, sweat dripping down your temple, listening to the restless groans of men around you. The night does not cool. The air remains heavy, pungent with the stink of bodies and rot. You think of winter and almost laugh. The frostbite, the numb toes, the misery of snow. In that season, you cursed the cold. Now you curse the heat. There is no winning, only enduring. You turn again, pull your cloak just loosely enough to shield your skin from the insects, and try to breathe shallowly, as if you could trick your body into believing the air is lighter. Around you, men sigh, mutter, scratch, groan. Summer is merciless. But so is war. And so you close your eyes, surrendering once more to exhaustion, knowing that dawn will come hot and fast, and the march will continue, sweat soaking your tunic before you've even broken fast. The night deepens, and you discover that warmth is a puzzle solved not only with cloaks and bodies, but with the scraps of ingenuity soldiers cling to when the elements refuse to show mercy. You shift on the straw, feeling the chill creep again through the seams of the tent, and you realize how many little tricks men invent to fight the cold. Some are clever, some are desperate, and some are downright foul, but each one has kept a soldier breathing long enough to see the next dawn. You hear rustling as a man near the edge of the tent pushes his cloak aside and begins layering the ground beneath him with whatever he's managed to scavenge. Pine branches cut from nearby woods, laid flat like a bed of needles. The resin fills the air with a sharp, clean scent, not unpleasant, and when he lies back down, you can almost feel his satisfaction. The branches lift him off the damp earth, the needles creating a springy cushion that keeps the worst of the chill away. Another soldier, not so lucky with trees, has piled up moss in a sack, stuffing it until the seams strain. He lays his head on it, as though it were a goose feather pillow, and though it leaks dampness, he sighs with comfort all the same. Improvised insulation is everywhere if you know where to look. Some men spread their spare cloaks across the ground, layering them, not over their shoulders, but beneath their bodies, because the earth steals warmth more ruthlessly than the air ever could. Others wedge their shields into the dirt along the tent's edge, blocking the draft that sneaks under the canvas. You see it in the dark, rows of spears, shields, even battered helmets pressed into service not as weapons, but as barricades against wind. War has a way of teaching you that every object can have two lives. One on the battlefield, and one in the desperate silence after. And then there are the stranger methods. You remember hearing, almost with disbelief, of soldiers smearing. The gaps at the base of tents with a mixture of straw and dung, the stench suffocating, but the effect surprisingly effective. The muck hardened into a kind of plaster, sealing the cold out. And though no man bragged about sleeping beside it, more than one survived the night because of it. You think of the man who first tried it, the disgust of his companions, and then the grudging respect when they realized it worked. Misery makes pragmatists of everyone. In some armies, men even hauled sacks of earth inside to mound against the edges of the tent, building a kind of miniature wall to trap the warmth of bodies within. Others dug shallow trenches outside to divert rain, then piled the soil along the walls for added insulation. From the outside, such tents looked like earthen huts, more than canvas shelters. From the inside, they felt like miracles. Small ones, but miracles nonetheless. You imagine the pride of those men, pointing to their patched-up walls and declaring they'd built a fortress out of nothing more than dirt. Yet for all the improvisation, there are debates among scholars about how common these tricks truly were. Some argue that the majority of soldiers had neither the time nor the energy to fuss with such details, collapsing into tents as they were, too exhausted to care. Others insist that survival itself demanded it, that no one who marched more than a few days could endure without finding ways to insulate against the elements. The records are patchy. Chroniclers rarely bothered to note the mundane, but hints remain, scattered in descriptions of camps that reeked of smoke, dung, and pine resin all at once. The silence of the sources may not mean absence, only that no one thought the obvious worth writing. Still, there is one story you cannot shake, half anecdote, half absurdity. It's said that in one particularly brutal winter, soldiers packed their clothing with chicken feathers, plucked hastily from the poor birds traveling with the baggage train. Men walked about looking like strange, overstuffed creatures, but at night their feather-lined tunics gave them warmth the wool alone never could. Whether the tale is true or not, you almost wish you could try it, ridiculous though it sounds. You imagine lying here, rustling faintly with every movement, feathers poking through seams, but blissfully warmer than the men beside you. Survival rarely looks dignified, and so, as you curl tighter into your own patch of straw, you envy and admire the inventions around you. The pine branches, the moss pillow, the dung-sealed walls, all proof that men will twist every scrap of the world into tools when the night demands it. You close your eyes and wonder what other tricks tomorrow might bring, what desperate solution you'll be willing to try when the cold sharpens its teeth again. For now, you are wrapped in wool, pressed against bodies, lying on straw, and it is enough. Barely. But enough. Your belly growls in the dark, loud enough that the man beside you mutters and shifts, tugging his cloak tighter as though the noise were a personal insult. Hunger has a way of sharpening the cold, making the body feel more brittle, less willing to endure. You think back to the thin stew ladled into your bowl earlier that evening, little more than warm water flavored with onions, oats, and the faint ghost of salted meat. For a brief moment, the heat of it spread through you, glowing like a coal. But now, hours later, that warmth is gone, leaving only the ache of emptiness gnawing at your ribs. Food and warmth are bound together here. One fuels the other, and when one is missing, the night feels twice as long. The camp is full of smells, but tonight you focus on the faint trace of cooking that still lingers near the fires. Someone roasted a hare, the scent of singed fur still clinging to the air. Others boiled beans until the mush thickened into a glue that stuck to wooden spoons. In wealthier companies, wine was warmed with spices, passed around in steaming mugs. That left a sweetness in the air. You weren't so lucky. Your portion was the standard fare, pottage, a vague blend of whatever grains, roots, and scraps could be found. Boiled until it was impossible to name any ingredient. It filled the stomach, just enough to keep you marching, but never enough to ease the hunger. Still, even such humble meals had their power. For a few fleeting minutes after swallowing, you felt warmer, the blood moving faster, the body tricked into thinking it was safe. There were other tricks too. Soldiers often drank ale before sleep, not the strong brews of modern taverns, but weak, sour mixtures that were safer than water. The alcohol was low, but just enough to warm the belly and soften the edge of fear. Men claimed a mug before bed meant fewer shivers, though in truth it probably just dulled their senses enough to forget how cold they were. Some armies even issued daily rations of wine or beer, knowing that a slightly inebriated soldier might grumble less, even if his body was no warmer. You can picture them now, laughing too loudly at nothing, then stumbling into tents, collapsing on straw in a haze of fumes that mixed with the ever-present stench of wool and sweat. One of the stranger customs was the use of hot broth as a kind of midnight cure. If fires burned late, men sometimes dipped bread into simmering pots, letting it soak until it turned mushy, then gulped it down before crawling into their cloaks. The broth, for a few brief moments, made them believe the night would be bearable. You think of your own empty bowl and feel a pang of envy at the thought of warm liquid still sloshing in someone else's stomach. Even the illusion of comfort matters when sleep is fragile, but not every stomach was filled. On long campaigns, supplies dwindled and the rations grew thin. Chroniclers record nights when soldiers went without food entirely, their bodies curled, tighter against the cold, conserving what little energy remained. Men chewed on leather straps, gnawed roots dug from frozen soil, even boiled grass when desperation pressed hardest. You shudder to imagine lying in this same tent, the cold pressing in, the belly hollow, sleep impossible. Hunger and cold together are merciless allies. And yet the strange thing is how food became a ritual of hope. Before bed, no matter how poor the portion, men gathered at fires, bowls in hand, sharing what they had. Laughter often accompanied the meager meal, jokes about the thinness of stew, boasts about the imaginary feasts waiting at home. One chronicle even describes soldiers pretending to season their bowls with invisible spices, sprinkling air with their fingers to make their comrades laugh. Hunger made them inventive, but humor made them endure. Historians still debate the exact effect of food on warmth. Some argue that hot meals truly made a measurable difference, that the calories and heat of stew carried soldiers through frigid nights. Others suggest the effect was mostly psychological. that the sense of being fed gave courage even when the body remained cold. Perhaps both are true. You know, lying here with your stomach aching, that you'd give almost anything for another bowl, whether it helped your body or only your mind. Warmth and food blur together in moments like this. Both are promises, both are fleeting, and both are always in too short supply. You curl tighter in the straw, pressing your cloak around you, and imagine the taste of broth still on your tongue. The growl in your belly lingers, but so does the memory of warmth, faint and fading. Outside, the fires sputter lower, and the night presses colder. You close your eyes, hoping that sleep, at least, will numb the hunger until dawn. Your stomach quiets, at least for now, and you settle back into the straw. The night stretches endlessly, but even in its misery, there are reminders that not every soldier lies under canvas in the same way. The tent you huddle in, damp and crowded, is not the tent of a knight, nor of an officer. It is the tent of the common man, cheap canvas patched a dozen times, walls sagging inward, a roof so low that if you try to sit upright, you'll scrape your head against the wet fabric. But just across the camp, a very different kind of shelter rises, its silhouette visible even in the dark, larger, taller, adorned with pennants, lit by a warmer glow. There, rank and privilege declare themselves even in sleep. You think of the knights who stride through camp by day, armor polished, cloaks lined with fur, horses adorned with saddles more richly made than any man's bedding. By night, those same knights retreat into pavilions, tents so tall a man can stand upright, their canvas dyed in stripes of bright colors, sometimes even painted with heraldic devices. Inside, they have wooden frames to lift them off the ground, feather mattresses carried on wagons, fur blankets spread out in layers. A squire tends to the fire outside, another guards the flap, while the knight himself drifts into sleep with relative comfort. Compared to your huddle of straw and stink, it is a different world entirely. Chroniclers do not hide this disparity. They describe campaigns where noble tents looked like miniature palaces, with carpets laid on the ground and lanterns hanging from poles. Officers sometimes even dined in their tents on proper tables, seated on stools or cushions. The meal followed, by warm wine before sleep. The difference between them and the rank and file was stark, and no one pretended otherwise. In war, as in peace, wealth carved out comfort. The knight might march beside you in daylight, but at night his world and yours are divided by canvas, walls. It is not only knights, of course. Officers of all kinds managed better. Commanders received larger portions of food, better access to firewood, more blankets and cloaks. Even when supplies dwindled, their needs were met first. A captain's tent was not just a place to sleep. It was also his command post, a gathering hall for planning, a symbol of authority. You imagine him even now, lying beneath furs, a candle burning at his side, while his men crouch in the mud, outside. And yet, privilege did not always shield them completely. There are stories of noble tents collapsing in storms, of silk pavilions leaking worse than rough canvas, of feather beds soaked through until the down clumped into useless lumps. Comfort was a matter of degree, not guarantee. A knight might wake less stiff, less frozen, but still miserable enough to complain. Misery on campaign is universal. It only wears different cloaks. Still, the resentment brewed. Men whispered about the gap between their lives and those of their lords. Some grumbled that knights had more blankets than they needed while their men froze. Others muttered that if the nobility truly cared for their soldiers, they'd share the comforts. But such whispers rarely left the tent. The order of things was too deeply ingrained, and to question it aloud was to risk punishment. Better to pull your cloak tighter, curse under your breath, and remember that in war, fairness is as scarce as warmth. One curious detail lingers in memory. Some knights brought their own folding beds on campaign, wooden frames that could be assembled and disassembled with ease. They raised them above the ground, laid mattresses atop them, and slept as though still at home. Common soldiers mocked them for their softness, but but secretly envied them too. There are even records of officers carrying entire chests of linens and pillows, luxuries beyond imagining for men who considered themselves fortunate to own a single blanket. You picture the wagons hauling these treasures, creaking under the weight, while barefoot soldiers trudged alongside. And you wonder how. Many curses were muttered under breath as men watched their betters sleep soft while they shivered. Historians, as always, find room to argue. Some insist that such luxuries were rare, exceptions rather than the rule, pointing out the difficulty of transporting so much baggage on long campaigns. Others counter that evidence abounds of nobles insisting on their comforts, dragging along, wagons stuffed with furnishings even when it slowed the march. The truth likely lay somewhere in between. Knights enjoyed comforts when possible, but abandoned them when speed demanded. You, lying in your straw, cannot help but think that if you had the choice, you'd risk the wagons too. And so you return to your own reality. Damp earth beneath, coarse wool above, the smell of sweat and mildew all around. Across the camp, Knight might be dreaming on feathers, his tent glowing faintly in the night. But here, you curl into your cloak, reminding yourself that warmth feels the same, whether it comes from straw or silk, so long as it carries you to morning. Privilege may decide comfort, but survival belongs to anyone who can endure. The canvas shudders as a gust of wind rattles the ropes, and for a moment, you think the whole tent will lift off into the night. You push your palm against the wall, steadying it, and feel the damp fabric press back against your hand. The structure is fragile, a thin skin stretched between you and the world, and though you try to trust it, you know better. A storm is always waiting to remind you that tents are temporary, and that nature doesn't bow to armies, no matter how grand. By day, the camp looks impressive. Rows of tents like a city of cloth, banners fluttering, smoke rising from fires. But by night, under rain or sleet or wind, the illusion cracks. Water finds its way in through seams, no matter how tightly stitched. Mud creeps under the edges, swallowing straw until the floor feels like a swamp. You roll to one side and find dampness spreading, soaking into cloak and hose, as though the earth itself were climbing up to claim you. Some soldiers prop their shields along the walls to block the draft. Others dig trenches around their tents to divert the runoff, but still the water comes. You begin to realize that a tent is not so much a barrier as a suggestion, a request for mercy from weather that rarely listens. Canvas itself has its limits. Most tents in medieval Europe were made from hemp or linen, sometimes coated with wax or fat to help resist rain. It worked for a time, until the coating wore away or the fabric aged. Then the canvas drank the storm like a thirsty beast, sagging heavy with water until it bulged inward. You've seen men wake in panic as the roof above them pooled with rain, and then, with one unlucky shift, spilled its entire weight onto the sleepers below. In summer, the wet cloth reeked of mildew. In winter, it froze solid, stiff as wood, so that men woke beneath a roof of ice. The rich, of course, had better. Knights' pavilions were reinforced with wooden poles, their walls often treated, their seams tighter. Some were even double-layered, with an inner lining to catch the leaks before they reached the bedding. But such luxuries were rare. Most soldiers lay beneath canvas, no more reliable than a fisherman's sail, and when storms swept in, rank mattered less than gravity. Water does not care for heraldry. One curious habit you've heard of is soldiers using their cloaks not just as bedding but as extra roofing. Men would sling them across the tent from one pole to another, doubling the thickness overhead. In theory, it kept the rain from dripping directly down. In practice, the added weight often caused the tent to collapse even faster. Still, men tried it because anything was better than waking soaked. Another trick was smearing seams with tallow candles, melting wax into the gaps. It worked for a night or two, until the wax cracked in the cold, and the leaks returned worse than before. You picture a soldier cursing, sticky with wax, and almost laugh at the futility of it. Survival was never elegant. Historians debate the effectiveness of medieval tents, whether they were truly up to the demands of large campaigns. Some claim they were sturdy enough, pointing to records of vast encampments surviving months at a time. Others argue that the chronic complaints of soldiers about dampness, mildew, and collapse prove the tents were woefully inadequate, more symbol than shelter. Perhaps both are true. A tent could stand proud one day and collapse the next, depending on weather, soil, and the sheer luck of the rope knots. The greatest danger, though, was wind. A gale could rip pegs from the ground, send canvas flapping like sails, poles tumbling onto sleeping men. There are stories of entire camps unraveling overnight, tents flying apart so that men woke under the naked sky, rain pelting their faces, possessions scattered like leaves. Commanders cursed such nights not only for the discomfort, but for the chaos. An army without tents looked less like an army and more like a rabble, and morale, as fragile as canvas itself, often tore along with the ropes. And yet, for all their faults, tents remained. There was no other option. Stone houses were rare along the march, barns too few to hold thousands. Soldiers needed something light enough to carry, simple enough to pitch, and cheap enough to replace. A tent was imperfect, but it was what stood between soldier and sky. You press your palm once more against the damp canvas wall and feel the storm breathing on the other side. Patient and vast. The tent will hold, you tell yourself. At least for tonight. You shift back into your cloak, curl tighter, and let the sound of rain drumming above become its own kind of lullaby. It is not comfort, not safety, but it is rhythm, steady and relentless. And perhaps rhythm is enough to carry you into uneasy sleep, until dawn pries open the camp once more. The rain outside softens into a drizzle, but the quiet does not bring comfort. If anything, the stillness makes you more aware of the other presence lurking in every tent. Sickness. You shift in the straw, and your elbow brushes against the man beside you. His skin feels hot, feverish, though the night is cold. He mutters something in his sleep, breath sour, and you edge away as much as the cramped space allows. This is the other truth of sleeping so close together. When one man sickens, the tent sickens. Illness passes faster than warmth, and you lie awake wondering if each cough in the dark is the one that will find its way into your own lungs. Medieval armies were breeding grounds for disease. Thousands of men packed into tight camps, sharing bedding, cloaks, and air, while water ran foul and food spoiled. Dysentery, fevers, and coughs spread like wildfire, sometimes claiming more soldiers than swords or arrows ever could. You can almost hear the numbers whispered in the dark. Whole companies weakened before a battle, men too weak to lift spears, all because the camp itself was poisoned. Doctors, or what passed for doctors, moved through tents with herbs and ointments, but their knowledge was limited. Sometimes they bled the sick, sometimes they prayed, sometimes they prescribed rest that was impossible when the horn called at dawn. What makes the night more miserable is the sound of it. A cough here, a groan there, the restless shifting of bodies in fever. You hear someone wheeze, his breath rattling like parchment torn in slow motion. Another man whispers prayers into the dark, asking saints to carry him through until morning. The tent becomes a chorus of suffering, and sleep is shredded by the awareness that any of those sounds could be yours by tomorrow. You clutch your cloak tighter, as though wool alone could shield you from invisible sickness. Odd remedies appear in such nights. Soldiers stuffed garlic into their mouths, swearing it warded off infection. Others tied herbs, sage, rosemary, or rue around their necks, believing the smell would keep illness at bay. One curious habit was hanging onions from the tent poles, the bulbs thought to absorb bad air before it reached the lungs. You picture it now, tents reeking of onions, soldiers lying beneath them like offerings in a kitchen, and you cannot help but smile at the absurdity. Yet perhaps the act itself brought comfort, and in the dark, belief can be as powerful as medicine. Still, there is a lingering question historians wrestle with. How much did armies truly understand about contagion? Some argue they knew little, treating disease as divine punishment or bad luck. Others point to evidence that commanders did take steps, digging latrines away from tents, spacing camps when possible, even isolating the visibly ill. The truth lies muddled between ignorance and instinct. Even without knowing the science, soldiers learned patterns, that bad air and dirty water bred sickness, that crowding made things worse, that sometimes the only cure was distance. Yet in war, distance was rarely possible. The army marched together, camped together, slept together, and sickened together. The cruelty of it is how illness strips dignity. A man who marched proudly by your side in the morning might, by night, be curled in the straw, too weak to lift his head. He soils himself. Where he lies, no strength to reach the latrines, and the stench fills the tent. No one complains aloud, because tomorrow it could be them. Instead, comrades adjust cloaks, shift straw, perhaps whisper encouragement, though in truth the silence says more. Survival is a fragile gift, and pity is all that can be spared. You turn in your own bedding, trying not to breathe too deeply, trying to believe that exhaustion alone explains the heat in your cheeks. Around you, the coughing continues, punctuated by groans, prayers, and muttered curses. Outside, the drizzle taps against canvas like a steady drum, indifferent to human frailty. Inside, the air is thick, damp, and heavy with illness. You close your eyes, not sure whether sleep is a shield or a surrender, and hope dawn will find you still breathing. You lie awake, half listening to the rasp of coughing and the steady patter of rain, when another sound filters through the canvas, soft, low, and deliberate. It is the voice of a man whispering a prayer. At first you think it's a murmur of fever, but then others join. Scattered voices threading the darkness with the rhythm of familiar words. Some whisper Ave Marias, others mutter Paternosters, and a few simply call on saints by name, asking for protection from cold, sickness, and the thousand little miseries of camp life. In these moments, the tent becomes not only a shelter, but a chapel, the thin roof above you as close to heaven as any cathedral. Religion seeps into the night as naturally as smoke from the fires. Soldiers carry charms around their necks, crosses carved from wood, bits of bone said to be relics, coins marked with holy symbols. Some kiss them before sleep, pressing lips to metal worn smooth by years of touch. Others clutch rosaries, beads, slipping through fingers in the dark, each prayer a lullaby against fear. In an age when the line between divine will and daily survival was blurred, no soldier dared sleep without at least a whispered nod to God. And yet, it isn't only God they call on. You remember hearing of men in northern campaigns who muttered charms against frost spirits, old words remembered from grandmothers rather than priests. They tied little bundles of herbs to the tent poles, half Christian, half pagan, believing that as long as the bundle remained, no soldier inside would freeze. In some places, salt was sprinkled around the bedding, not to season food, but to ward off evil. You can almost picture the tent floor glimmering faintly white, the men above it snoring, comforted not by logic, but by ritual. One story sticks in your mind. A soldier in Burgundy who swore by the power of a tiny carved figure he carried. It was no saint, no Christ, just a squat little idol passed down in his family. He kept it wrapped in cloth and tucked beneath his cloak every night, telling anyone who asked that it had kept his grandfather alive in war, and his father, and so it would him. Others scoffed, but they still touched it when he offered, just in case. When you're at war, you stop laughing at any talisman that promises survival, but here too lies debate. Did men truly believe their prayers shielded them from cold and sickness? Or were these rituals simply habits, comforting motions that distracted from the misery? Some scholars argue faith was absolute, that soldiers saw their survival as proof of divine favor. Others suggest men were more pragmatic, using prayer as they used cloaks and fires. One more tool against the night, whether or not they trusted its power. Perhaps both are true. Faith does not always need certainty. Sometimes it is enough that the words themselves give weight to hope. The role of priests in camp shaped these nights as well. In larger armies, chaplains walked from tent to tent, offering blessings before men settled in. They carried relics, led processions, sprinkled holy water on the canvas itself. On the eve of battle, whole companies might kneel in the mud, chanting prayers in unison while candles flickered in the wind. You imagine it now. Hundreds of voices rising together, filling the night with sound so strong it almost drowned out the wind. To sleep after such a ritual must have felt like resting in God's own hand, however cold the earth beneath. And yet, faith could turn sour. If men froze or sickened despite their prayers, whispers of divine abandonment crept in. Some muttered that God favored the enemy, that their own sins had brought misery down upon them. Others sought scapegoats within the camp, someone not praying enough, someone harboring secret heresy, someone whose very presence cursed the rest. Fear and faith entwined, one feeding the other until the line between blessing and blame grew thin. You tug your cloak tighter, listening to the muttered prayers around you. Some are sincere, some slurred with exhaustion, some barely more than instinct. But all are there, filling the dark with words meant to keep despair at bay. Whether or not they work is beside the point. A prayer warms the mind, if not the body, and sometimes that is all a soldier needs to carry him into sleep. You close your eyes, and for a moment, you let yourself imagine that the words drifting through the tent weave into a shield, invisible, but strong, holding back the cold, the sickness, the fear. Outside, the storm mutters on. Inside, you surrender to exhaustion, whispering a few words of your own, not certain you believe them, but grateful for the comfort they bring. The night stretches long, and though your body aches for rest, your mind lingers on the way stories ripple through the camp. In truth, the tent is not only a place to sleep, but also a theatre where imagination thrives. Because men, crammed shoulder to shoulder with little else to do, will always fill the dark with words. Once the coughing eases, once the groans quiet, someone begins to whisper, sometimes a tale of home, sometimes a memory of battle, sometimes a story so wild it can only be born from boredom and fear stitched together. These murmurs drift like smoke, curling from one cot to another, weaving their way through the gloom until the tent is alive with narrative. You turn your head and listen. One man recalls the village he left behind, his voice soft but tinged with longing. He describes fields of barley swaying in summer, the bell of the parish church tolling across hills, the scent of baking bread rising from his mother's hearth. The tent falls silent, men closing their eyes as if to see it too, to borrow that warmth of memory. For a few moments the cold feels softer, the damp less oppressive. Then someone chuckles and interrupts with a bawdy rhyme, full of farmers' daughters and ale spilled in taverns, and the spell breaks in laughter. The tent swings between reverie and raucousness, each story a lifeline against the endless dark. This habit of telling tales is as old as armies themselves. Chroniclers hint at it. Soldiers gathering by the fire to share songs, recite epics, or spin jokes, but they rarely capture the intimacy of how it must have felt within a tent. A story could pass the time until sleep, yes, but it also drew men together, binding them not by duty, but by shared imagination. One man's words became everyone's dream, and in a life where each day threatened to erase you, that was no small gift. Yet not all stories were cheerful. Superstition seeps through these murmurs too. You hear a man whisper of a ghost said to haunt a battlefield nearby, a pale rider who appears before disaster. Another claims he heard wolves howling not far from camp, and that their cries are omens of death. Some mutter charms, crossing themselves or clutching tokens when the stories take a darker turn. You feel the tension thicken, the cold pressing harder, until someone snorts and makes a crude joke to banish the fear. It is a cycle as predictable as the dawn. Memory, laughter, fear, dismissal, and then it begins again. One curious tradition. You've heard of his soldiers composing riddles to stump one another. Little puzzles tossed into the dark like sparks. Some were clever, drawn from scripture or folklore, others crude, meant only to provoke laughter. Imagine lying half asleep and being jolted awake by a riddle about a goose, a bishop, and a wheel of cheese, the punchline leaving everyone groaning. Such silliness might seem out of place in war, but in truth, it is what keeps men sane. If you cannot laugh in the dark will swallow you whole. Historians disagree on how much weight to give these nighttime tales. Some argue that they were a crucial part of military life, shaping morale, preserving culture, and even passing along coded information. Others suggest that chroniclers exaggerated, romanticizing what was likely little more than idle chatter. But lying here, you know better. Words are as essential as cloaks and fire. Without them, silence would crush you. Without them, the tent would feel less like shelter and more like a tomb. You shift in the straw, listening as another story begins. This one about a knight who swore his sword was forged from a fallen star. The details change with every telling. Sometimes the sword glows in battle. Sometimes it sings. Sometimes it thirsts for blood. Tonight, the man claims the blade could cut through armor as though it were linen. Everyone laughs, but you still find yourself picturing the weapon, gleaming in the moonlight, the knight striding victorious. Even in disbelief, the story carries you away, softening the edges of the night. Your eyes close, and the words swirl into dreams, part memory, part invention. The tent around you is no longer just canvas and straw. It is a cocoon of voices, of human imagination refusing to yield to misery. Perhaps tomorrow you will add your own story, whether of home, of ghosts, or of some invented marvel. For now, you let the murmurs carry you, half waking, half dreaming. A soldier in a world where survival depends as much on tales as on swords. The stories linger, looping through the night like a rhythm as steady as the rain. You half drift in and out of sleep, but each burst of laughter or whisper of dread pulls you back again. The tent feels more alive now than it did in silence, as if the words themselves are a kind of fire, warming without flame. One man recalls his first campaign, speaking of a march so long that boots wore through and men wrapped their feet in rags. He swears that by night, their captain ordered songs to keep despair from seeping into the camp. The songs, he says, weren't hymns or ballads, but crude parodies of noble verses, mocking kings, mocking priests, mocking even themselves. The laughter carried them further than any ration of bread. You listen, smiling despite yourself, and wonder if memory has painted it rosier than it was. But does that matter? In war, the truth is often less important than the comfort it can provide in retelling. Someone else picks up the thread and hums a tune, low and off-key. It spreads, hesitantly at first, then fuller, until half the tent is humming along. It's no grand performance, just a handful of tired voices weaving together, but in the gloom it becomes a lullaby. For a brief moment, the tent is not a battlefield's waiting room but a home of sorts, a place where men share song the way they share cloaks. You feel your eyes close, lulled by the vibration of sound as much as by exhaustion. But not all stories or songs end in ease. There are darker moments when the murmurs turn bitter. A man mutters about lords feasting while their soldiers starve, about captains sleeping on feather beds while their men curl on straw. His voice sharpens with resentment until another shushes him quickly, reminding him that walls have ears, even canvas ones. Silence follows, heavy and uneasy, until someone lightens it again with another joke. Yet the bitterness lingers, an undercurrent that cannot quite be erased. It is here that the tent reveals its duality. It is a place of unity, yes, but also of friction. Stories can bind, but they can also divide. A man's tale of bravery might inspire, or it might provoke envy. A man's memory of plenty might remind others only of their lack. Even laughter can breed irritation in those too tired to join in. The tent is a crucible of human emotion, compressed until it spills in whispers. You learn to listen carefully, to weigh words before repeating them, to laugh even when you don't feel like it, because laughter, like warmth, must be shared or it dies. And then there are the tales no one admits to believing but everyone listens to anyway. The omens, the curses, the predictions of death. A raven seen circling the camp, a dream of blood, a candle that refused to stay lit. These become fodder for hushed conversations, men testing fate with their words. Some scoff loudly, insisting that only fools heed such nonsense. But you notice the same men clutching charms tighter under their cloaks. Belief, after all, is not always spoken. Scholars still debate whether such nightly storytelling carried any real influence on morale, or whether it was little more than a way to pass restless hours. Some argue that the ritual of shared tales was vital, that it transformed the misery of camp life into something bearable. Others dismiss it as idle chatter, too fleeting to matter. But lying here, you feel the truth settle somewhere in between. The stories do not erase the cold, the damp, or the hunger, but they make them survivable. And survival is everything. You close your eyes once more, letting the words blur into dreams. You see barley fields and ghostly riders, star-forged swords, and bawdy taverns, all stitched together into a tapestry only soldiers could weave. Tomorrow, the march will grind forward. Tomorrow, swords and arrows will claim their due. But tonight, in this fragile bubble of canvas and straw, imagination itself keeps the cold at bay. You surrender to it, the murmur of stories fading into, the rhythm of sleep, and at last you drift deeper, carried not by warmth but by words. The first thin edge of dawn has not yet touched the camp, and already you feel the weight of another presence pressing in. Not cold, not hunger, not even sickness, but the sheer weight of discipline. In the tent, the space is cramped, and the rules are unwritten, but they are no less binding. You learn quickly that the way you move, the way you lie, even the way you breathe can irritate the men beside you. Sleep in an army is not just survival, it is negotiation. You shift in the straw, trying to ease the stiffness in your back, and a muttered curse comes from the man you jostled. He yanks his cloak tighter, pulling it away from where it overlapped yours. The warmth you shared is broken, and instantly you feel the draft settle in. You swallow your pride and tug your knees to your chest, curling smaller, knowing that to protest would only sour tempers further. In a tent, space is as precious as gold, and no one surrenders it willingly. Arguments flare often in such close quarters. One man snores too loudly, another hogs the straw, another's boots stink so foully that the entire tent groans. Words are exchanged in whispers at first, then louder, until tempers boil over. A shove here, a slap there, fists clenching in the dark. Most of the time, it fizzles out before violence, the men too exhausted to waste energy. But sometimes blows are thrown, and the tent erupts into chaos until comrades pull them apart. Then silence follows, thick and awkward, and men return to their corners, resentful but resigned. You lie still, heart racing, aware that peace here is as fragile as canvas in the wind. And yet, discipline does not only come from within the tent. Commanders know that disorder at night leads to disaster by day. Rules are set. Tents must be pitched in neat rows, bedding arranged with care, weapons always at hand. Some armies even enforced specific sleeping orders, men arranged by unit, by rank, by task, so that no tent became a lawless jumble. Punishments for disobedience could be harsh. A soldier caught fighting his comrade in the night might face flogging. One who left camp without leave could find himself branded as a deserter. Sleep was not meant to excuse discipline. It was meant to prove it. Still, soldiers found ways to rebel in small ways. A man might swap places with a friend in another tent, sneaking past officers to sleep beside comrades he trusted. Others carved out little corners of privacy with cloaks hung from poles, pretending at solitude even in the crush. One curious trick you hear of is men drawing lines in the straw with their daggers, dividing the ground into invisible plots that no one dared cross. Ridiculous as it seems, these tiny territories helped keep peace, each man knowing where he belonged and where he did not. Historians disagree on just how much order truly reigned in these encampments. Some claim discipline was rigid, that tents ran like clockwork under the eyes of strict captains. Others argue the reality was messier, that soldiers in their exhaustion ignored rules, collapsing wherever they pleased. The truth is probably somewhere between discipline at dawn, chaos by midnight, and a constant tug of war between command and fatigue. You feel that tug yourself, caught between the desire to sprawl for comfort and the need to keep peace with the men beside you. As the night deepens, you realize that discipline in the tent is not about rules written on parchment, but about unspoken agreements born of necessity. Share warmth, but not too much. Make noise, but not too often. Keep your boots where they won't poison the air. Respect these fragile customs, and you'll survive. Break them, and the tent itself becomes another battlefield. You close your eyes, listening to the uneasy breathing around you, and wonder if perhaps the hardest part of soldiering is not the sword or the march, but the art of learning how to sleep among men who are just as desperate, just as weary, just as quick to anger as you are. The tent is a crucible, forging not only endurance but tolerance, and tonight you feel both tested to their limits. The tent creaks with the weight of its occupants, a dozen men pressed together in the sour warmth of breath and wool, and every shift of body or mutter of voice reminds you that order here is as fragile as firelight. You pull the cloak closer, but your thoughts keep circling back to the truth. You are not sleeping alone, and that means every moment of rest is a negotiation of temper, patience, and endurance. One man snores so violently that you can almost feel the vibrations in your ribs. Another responds by jabbing him in the side, provoking a grunt, then silence before the noise resumes. The cycle repeats until even the most tolerant among you begins to curse. You smother your laugh in the wool at your face, because to laugh openly would earn you an elbow. This is how the night drags. Half comedy, half torment. Disputes are constant. Someone shifts and kicks another man's shin. Someone pulls at a cloak in search of more cover. A man mutters that his straw has been stolen. Another swears someone took his place too close to the warmest spot near the tent pole. These quarrels do not stop at words. You've seen men wrestle in the dark, rolling through mud and straw, their scuffle waking the entire tent. In the morning they march side by side again, silent and bruised, because war allows no room for grudges. But at night, tempers burn short, and canvas walls cannot contain it. Commanders are not blind to these frictions. Some require strict sleeping orders, with men arranged by rank or by long familiarity, to minimize quarrels. There are accounts of tents divided between comrades who had known each other for years, deliberately avoiding mixing strangers whose tempers might clash. Others favored the opposite, scattering men from different villages or regions to force bonds of brotherhood, hoping necessity would carve unity where none existed. Which method worked best is debated still, though you can see the sense in both. Familiarity breeds comfort, but it also breeds quarrels. Strangers may clash, but sometimes they learn to trust faster when survival depends on it. Even in the smallest acts, discipline creeps in. A soldier caught stepping over another to leave the tent too noisily might be cursed, even struck. Boots, left in the wrong place, become hazards in the dark, tripping comrades on their way out to relieve themselves. Cloaks spread too wide are accused of stealing warmth from others. You realize that the tent is not only a shelter, but a classroom of constant lessons. How to compromise, how to share, how to endure without breaking the fragile peace that binds men together. And then, there are the odd rituals that emerge in such closeness. Some groups designate a man to tell a short tale before sleep, no matter how tired, no matter how bleak. If he refuses, others mutter that the tent will be cursed with unrest. Others agree to rotate positions each night, so that no man lies on the coldest patch of ground 2 nights in a row. These customs are not written in any order, but they shape life as surely as a commander's rule. They are survival in social form, keeping quarrels at bay and sanity intact. Historians puzzle over these fragments of order. Did soldiers truly impose such routines on themselves? Or are these stories exaggerations, neat little morals fitted to messy truths? Some argue that only the strict hand of officers kept tents from devolving into chaos, while others suggest men, left to themselves, invented systems out of sheer need. The truth, as always, likely lives in the blur between authority when it was near, invention when it was absent, compromise holding everything together. You roll onto your side, aware of the man's breath warm against your neck, another's, knee pressing into your calf. The discomfort is endless, the irritation constant, yet you know that tomorrow these same men will march beside you, shields raised in the same line. You may curse each other in the dark, but daylight demands unity. The tent is where you learn it, however unwillingly. As the night stretches on, you close your eyes once more. The straw scratches, the cloaks itch, the air stinks of sweat and mildew. But the quarrels have quieted for now, each man too tired to fight further. In the uneasy truce of exhaustion, the tent settles into stillness, and you drift at last, realizing that survival here is not just about warmth against the cold, it is about patience against the chaos of men. The night has nearly worn itself out, and yet you feel another kind of weight pressing against your thoughts. Not the cold, not hunger, not the quarrels of cramped men, but the silence that comes when the day's march is finally over, and your mind has nothing left to cling to but its own weariness. This is the secret enemy of the tent. Not just the discomfort of straw and damp canvas, but the gnawing ache of exhaustion, the way it burrows into your bones until even closing your eyes feels like work. You know the rhythm by now. March all day, miles of mud sucking at your boots, shoulders bent under the weight of shield and pack, sun burning or wind cutting, always one foot after the other until the horn calls halt. Then comes the work of pitching tents, gathering firewood, eating whatever rations are doled out. By the time you stumble into your corner of straw, the body wants nothing more than sleep. And yet, it rarely comes as quickly as you hope. Exhaustion is not the same as rest. Sometimes it makes you restless, your muscles twitching, your back aching, your thoughts racing, even though your eyelids droop. The tent groans with the sound of others fighting the same battle. Men toss and turn, muttering under their breath, swearing softly when a cramp seizes a calf, or a blistered foot throbs in the dark. Someone groans so loudly that you almost mistake it for injury, but it is only the sound of a body pushed beyond its limit. Another man shifts again and again, unable to find a patch of straw that eases his spine. You begin to realize that soldiers may march together, fight together, even eat together, but they suffer alone, each locked in the prison of his own body. There are tales of men collapsing so completely after a day's march that they fell asleep standing, leaning against their spears like trees. Others dropped onto the ground beside the road and refused to rise until shaken awake. In camp, it was not uncommon to see soldiers asleep before their rations reached them, mouths open, hands still clutching empty bowls. The body claimed what it needed when it could, and no tent, no order could prevent it. You think of those men with envy now, for even in misery, their exhaustion was merciful enough to grant sleep. But not everyone found such mercy. Sometimes the body rebels. You lie awake despite your fatigue, your legs aching with ghostly echoes of the march, your shoulders stiff beneath the weight of phantom armor. Your mind replays each step, each moment, until the night itself feels like another march you must endure. You shift, you roll, you sigh, and still sleep will not come. Around you, others do the same, a restless sea of men too tired to move, too weary to lie still. One curious habit soldiers developed was massaging their own legs before sleep, pounding thighs and calves with fists to loosen the knots of marching. Some even begged comrades to do it for them, trading the favor like coin. Another trick was stuffing boots with straw and sleeping with them still on, so that swollen feet would not stiffen in the cold night air. You picture it now. Men sprawled, in cloaks, boots still strapped, straw poking out like ragged feathers. It looks absurd, but anything that promised fewer blisters in the morning was worth the discomfort at night. Here, too, historians find disagreement. Some argue that exhaustion itself was the soldier's truest companion, that it allowed men to sleep through cold, hunger, and noise alike. Others counter that the strain of constant marching, combined with poor food and worse bedding, made genuine rest almost impossible, leaving soldiers in a perpetual haze of half-sleep. The truth is likely both. Some collapsed into slumber no storm could break. Others lay awake in misery, envying those who could surrender so easily. You feel yourself caught in the middle, eyes heavy but mind restless, body aching but refusing peace. The tent in these moments becomes more than shelter. It becomes a mirror, reflecting every weakness back at you. You cannot escape the ache of your muscles, the blisters on your feet, the gnaw of your stomach. You are forced to lie with them, to carry them into your dreams. The canvas above you may block the wind, but it cannot block the weight of exhaustion. You close your eyes and breathe, reminding yourself that morning always comes, whether you sleep or not. You curl onto your side, pulling the cloak tighter, but exhaustion is cruelly deceptive. It convinces you that sleep must surely come, then withholds it like a miser hoarding coins. Around you, the tent is full of the same deception. One man mutters in his dreams, another thrashes, another sighs heavily, and you realize that none of them are finding true peace. It is as if the whole camp breathes together, a restless animal tossing in its den. Exhaustion does strange things to the mind. You hear whispers that aren't there, the flap of canvas mistaken for footsteps, the groan of rope transformed into voices. A few men admit, quietly, that they sometimes see shapes in the dark, shadows at the edge of the tent, faces leaning in through seams. They know it is imagination, and yet the weariness makes it feel real. One soldier swears he saw his ayah's mother's face in the firelight one night after marching 3 days without proper rest. Another confessed to hearing bells, though no church was anywhere near. You wonder, listening to these tales, whether the mind invents such visions to remind itself that it still exists, that it has not been completely consumed by fatigue. When exhaustion becomes too great, the body betrays itself. You've seen men collapse on the march, knees buckling, eyes rolling back, their comrades dragging them up before officers noticed. In the tent, it is subtler. A man so tired he forgets to remove his helmet. Another who falls asleep mid-sentence, his words trailing into a snore. There is even a story of a soldier who slept while standing watch, eyes open, body swaying like a reed in the wind. They said he did not wake until dawn, when another shook him, and that he claimed to have dreamed the entire night while still upright. Whether true or not, it is the kind of tale men repeat when weariness blurs the line between absurdity and possibility. Food, of course, plays its part. On days when rations are plentiful, the warmth of a full belly drags men swiftly into slumber. On days of scarcity, the hunger gnaws, keeping the body restless no matter how tired the mind. Wine and ale are their own traps, one mug too many, and men collapse into snoring stupors. Too little, and they toss in frustration, craving the numbness it brings. The balance is delicate and rarely achieved. The debate lingers even among those who study such things centuries later. Did soldiers truly rest at night, or was their sleep always fractured, shallow, never more than a nap stolen before dawn? Some insist that the sheer weight of exhaustion must have pulled men down into deep, dreamless rest despite the noise and cold. Others argue that the conditions made proper sleep impossible, that soldiers marched and fought in a perpetual fog of weariness. Perhaps both are right. You feel it now, your body so heavy it aches, your mind so restless it refuses peace. You are at once too tired and not tired enough. And yet, for all its cruelty, exhaustion sometimes becomes its own blessing. The body can only resist so long. Eventually, no matter the noise, no matter the cold, no matter the hunger, the mind caves in, and drags you down into oblivion. You envy the men who find it quickly, but you know it will come for you too. Already your eyelids twitch, your thoughts blur, and the mutters around you fade into a distant hum. You breathe deep, letting the smell of damp straw fill your lungs, unpleasant but steady, and you tell yourself to stop fighting. Exhaustion is not an enemy to be beaten. It is a tide to be surrendered to. And so you let it take you, slow and steady, your body slackening into the heap of men, your mind slipping into the strange, fractured dreams of the soldier's night. You awaken with the strange heaviness that comes from too little rest, and for a moment you can't tell whether the night has passed or only shifted its shape. The tent is still dark, damp canvas pressed low, the air thick with the mingled scent of sweat, wool, and smoke. Your body feels no lighter for the hours spent lying here. Instead, it aches with the dull weight of interrupted dreams and the faint memory of voices echoing in the gloom. Sleep never feels whole in a soldier's tent. It comes in fragments, never a full gift, only scraps doled out between noises, alarms, and uneasy thoughts. And those thoughts never stop their work. You know this because men mutter them aloud in half-sleep. Worries about tomorrow's march, about dwindling food, about wounds festering under bandages. Some dream aloud of home, whispering names as though calling to loved ones across the miles. Others thrash in silence, their faces twisted with nightmares they will never admit to in daylight. A tent at night is a hive of private fears, each man fighting his own unseen battle, even as he lies shoulder to shoulder with his comrades. It is not just the body that grows weary in war. It is the mind, stretched thin by repetition and haunted by uncertainty. Each day you march and wait, march and fight, march and watch others fall, and in the night, the brain replays it all like a cruel minstrel, refusing to change his song. You remember flashes of battle, not as clear images but as sensations, the crack of wood, the stink of iron, the shriek of a dying horse. These fragments drift through your half-dreams, jarring you awake just when rest was about to claim you, and, sometimes, the dreams turn stranger still. Tales ripple through the camp of men, haunted by visions at night. Comrades lost in battle appearing in tents, silent and dripping with blood, or phantom voices whispering from beneath the straw. Some say it is only the work of fever, others that the devil himself slips into soldiers' dreams when they are too tired to resist. There are stories of men so shaken by their nightmares that they refuse to sleep again, sitting upright until dawn with wild eyes, muttering prayers to ward off what they had seen. Yet even here, the tent finds its humor. One soldier recounts, dreaming of feasting at a banquet, only to wake gnawing the edge of his bootstrap. Another claims he dreamed of a warm bed in an inn so vividly that he wept when he woke in the straw. Laughter follows these confessions, because laughter is the only shield men have against the truth. The mind betrays them as surely as the body does. You cannot control your dreams, and so you learn to make jokes of them, as though humor alone could chase away the shadows. Historians wrestle with how much weight to give these night terrors. Were they merely the product of exhaustion and poor diet? Or do they reveal something deeper about the strain of medieval war? Some suggest that soldiers carried trauma, much like men in modern armies, haunted by what they had seen and done, their nights fractured by memories. Others argue that our idea of trauma is too modern a lens, that medieval men accepted suffering as part of life, their nightmares less haunting and more ordinary. The truth may lie somewhere between, men hardened by expectation, yet still human enough to carry the scars into their dreams. You lie still, listening to the uneven rhythm of sleep around you, the snores, the murmurs, the sighs, and you feel the strangeness of it all. In daylight, the army seems like a single body, moving in ranks, ordered and unified. At night, in the tent, it breaks into fragments, a dozen minds wandering in a dozen different directions, each dream its own country, each fear its own battlefield. The canvas may bind you together physically, but inside it, you are each alone, with your ghosts. You close your eyes again, though you know the respite will not last. Already the drum of rain against canvas has shifted into the beat of marching feet in your imagination. Already the sigh of wind sounds too much like a dying cry. Exhaustion pulls you down once more, but you know the dreams will follow, whether they comfort or torment, whether they remind you of home or of the horrors you can't escape. The darkness folds itself around you again, and you drift into that uneasy space between waking and dreaming, where the body craves rest, but the mind refuses to unclench its grip. The tent is heavy with the presence of men wrestling their own thoughts, an entire world of fears and half-memories pressed together under one sagging canvas roof. You wonder, not for the first time, whether any of you truly sleep at all, or whether you only collapse into brief trances, your minds gnawing at themselves like rats in a sack. Someone beside you mutters a name, sharp enough to cut through the hum of snores. His brow shines with sweat, his lips trembling. He doesn't wake, but the sound makes every man nearby shift, as though reminded that nightmares are contagious, that the dread leaking from one man can infect all the rest. You pull your cloak higher and close your eyes, but your own mind betrays you. Images flood in, faces from home, blurred by distance, the hollow eyes of a comrade who fell last week, the endless road stretching forward with no promise of end. These are not dreams so much as intrusions, unwelcome guests who take advantage of your weakness to remind you of everything you cannot escape. There are whispered remedies for such unrest. Some soldiers swear by murmuring prayers before lying down, repeating them until the rhythm lulls them into something like peace. Others claim that holding a relic, a cross, a saint's medal, even a pebble from a holy place, keeps nightmares away. One particularly odd tale tells of men in a German company who rubbed the soles of their feet with vinegar before sleep, believing it drove away bad dreams. Whether or not it worked, they insisted on it with such seriousness that others in camp began trying the same until the entire tent reeked like a pickler's shop. The line between superstition and survival grows thinner with each mile marched, each night endured. And yet, for all these efforts, the dreams still come. Some nights they are banal, simple echoes of daily life, walking through a marketplace, hearing a church bell, speaking with a neighbor long gone. Other nights they are monstrous, blood flooding the tent floor, a familiar face twisted in agony, the sky itself falling. Men wake in silence, rarely speaking of what they saw, though you can tell from the hollowness in their eyes the next morning that something inside them did not rest. Historians debate how deep such dreams cut. Were they passing fancies of tired minds forgotten by dawn? Or were they scars, carried silently in the way men walked and spoke, hidden but unhealed? Some argue that medieval men, steeped in faith and accustomed to death, accepted nightmares as divine warnings or omens, interpreting them through the lens of scripture rather than psychology. Others suggest that soldiers then were no less haunted than those of any age, their unspoken terrors shaping them long after the battles ended. You can feel the weight of that argument in the heaviness of your own chest. Whatever explanation scholars prefer, the fear in the dark is real enough. The tent creaks, a gust of wind tugging at the ropes, and you are startled awake once more. Your heart thunders, though nothing has changed. The same damp air, the same faint snoring, the same bodies pressed in tight. You realize then how fragile the boundary is between dream and waking. The mind carries its phantoms from one to the other, and the tent becomes both bed and battlefield. You cannot escape it. You can only endure it, breath by breath, until the first grey light filters through the seams. You settle again, drawing what warmth you can from the man beside you, trying to slow your breathing. Exhaustion will claim you eventually. It always does. The body has no choice but to collapse, even if the mind resists. And when it does, you hope for gentler dreams, ones of bread ovens, of fields in spring, of a mother's voice calling you home. You know they may not come, but hope is stubborn, even in the darkest hours. And so you surrender again, this time willingly, letting the night take you where it will. The first crack of dawn filters through the canvas seams, pale and reluctant, as if even the sun hesitates to rise into the world soldiers must face. You open your eyes with the heaviness of stone, body stiff from straw and damp, mind clouded by dreams too jagged to count as rest. Around you, men stir in the same half-conscious haze, groaning as they try to peel themselves upright. Morning in camp is not awakening. It is wrenching yourself from one misery into another. The air inside the tent is thick, clinging with the heat of breath, the musk of sweat, and the sour tang of damp wool. Someone coughs, hacking into his cloak, and another curses softly at the draft sneaking through a gap where the canvas sagged in the night. Boots scrape as men fumble for them in the straw, pulling them on with grunts as stiff leather resists swollen feet. The debate over whether to sleep with boots on has already been fought through the night. But in the morning, it hardly matters. Your feet are throbbing either way. Outside, a trumpet brays, thin and sharp against the sluggish air. The sound cuts through the camp like a blade, dragging men into motion, whether their bodies are ready or not. You feel the ripple of irritation spread through the tent. A few muttered prayers, a few louder curses, but obedience wins. Cloaks are shaken out, swords buckled, helmets tugged on with stiff fingers. You know from the way some men stumble that they have barely slept at all, but the march waits for no one. The ritual of rising is its own form of survival. Straw is shaken from cloaks, packed roughly into sacks, tents pulled down with weary motions. Fire pits are kicked over, embers smothered in dirt. Within the hour, what was a village of canvas and smoke is gone, leaving only churned mud and the faint smell of ash. You look around as you work and realize how invisible your suffering will be to anyone who comes after. No one will know how cold the night felt, how sharp the straw pressed, how heavy the dreams lay. By noon, the ground will be trampled clean by another column of men, and your misery will be just another layer of mud. And still, as you stagger to your feet, you cannot help but marvel at the endurance of it all. Day after day, night after night, men endure this cycle, pitching tents, crowding into them, half sleeping on straw, then rising again to march toward another battle. Chroniclers often write of victories, of banners raised, of kings crowned. They write less often of mornings like these, when the true miracle is not survival in combat, but the ability to rise from the straw and keep moving at all. There are odd rituals in the morning too. Some men spit 3 times before leaving the tent to rid themselves of bad dreams. Others dip fingers in the ashes of last night's fire and smear them across their faces, a grimy blessing against cold and misfortune. You see one man kiss a charm hanging from his neck before he shoulders his pack, another rub the hilt of his sword as if waking it too. These little motions are not recorded in chronicles, but they are as real as the clank of armor and the thud of boots. Historians debate whether soldiers in such conditions truly functioned as coherent armies after so many broken nights, or whether fatigue turned them into shambling mobs barely capable of order. Some insist that strict discipline, constant drill, and shared purpose bound men into resilience greater than the sum of their weariness. Others argue that battles were often fought by men so tired they could hardly lift a sword, and that much of war was decided not by strength, but by which side endured exhaustion longer. You cannot help but feel the latter holds truth. Standing here now, bleary and aching, you know that victory is not always forged by courage, but by the stubbornness of simply not collapsing. You heft your pack, feeling the straps bite into your shoulders, and follow the shuffle of boots out into the chill air. The camp around you is a hive of motion. Men stumbling, horses stamping, officers shouting, banners rising, smoke curls weakly from dying embers. The ground is slick with mud, and already your boots are wet. Another day has begun, and with it, another march toward another night in another tent. You know the pattern will repeat until fortune or fate decides otherwise, and so, with a groan and a grim smile, you march on, leaving behind the canvas cocoon that was both prison and refuge. It will be pitched again tonight, somewhere down the road, and you will crawl back inside, pull your cloak tight, and once again try to trick your body into calling it rest. The march has only just begun, boots squelching in the mud, and already you feel the echo of the night pulling at your shoulders. Sleep never truly restores you here. It only dulls the edges of exhaustion long enough to carry you into the next day. Around you, the men move like shadows, faces slack, eyes hollow. Some cough into their cloaks, others mutter prayers under their breath, and a few stare straight ahead in silence, conserving what little strength remains. The morning is a grim procession, not of triumph, but of endurance. And yet this is the rhythm of the soldier's life in the field. Tents raised, tents struck, nights endured, mornings suffered. You begin to realize that survival is not a single act of bravery, but a long chain of small concessions. Sharing body heat when you'd rather have space, clutching a cloak when you'd rather cast it off, eating thin broth that barely counts as food, pushing your body forward one step at a time. The victories won in daylight are rooted in the nights no one records. The nights in which you learned how to lie half asleep on straw, in damp boots, beside men who snore and mutter and cough, and still find the strength to rise again. Even the smallest details of that nightly survival linger: the smell of damp canvas, the scratch of straw against your neck, the chill that seeps through cloak and wool. You know them too well. They cling to you like another layer of armor. And when you think of home, of beds, of firesides, of sheets, washed clean, you do so with a kind of aching disbelief, as if such comforts belong to another world entirely. Here, your world is canvas and straw, quarrels and whispers, fatigue and endurance. But you also remember the other side, the murmurs of prayer, the half-jokes whispered in the dark, the songs hummed by tired voices, the warmth of bodies pressed, together for survival. These, too, are part of the soldier's tent, just as real as the cold and hunger. They are the fragile bonds that keep men from shattering in the night. Without them, perhaps no army would ever rise at dawn. And so the tent, for all its misery, becomes something paradoxical. It is both burden and blessing, torment and salvation. It is where you curse your comrades and where you learn to need them most. It is where your body fails and where your spirit hardens. It is where you suffer and where you endure. By the time the sun finally rises high, burning away the mist, the night already feels like a memory, bitter but familiar. You know another one waits at the end of the march, another tent, another straw bed, another fight for warmth and silence, and you will crawl inside again because you must. This is how soldiers survive, not by avoiding misery, but by meeting it night after night and walking out again when the morning trumpet calls. Now that the march has carried you out of the tent, let yourself imagine slowing everything down. The voices fade, the coughs and clatter soften, and the weight of armor and canvas begins to lift from your shoulders. You no longer feel the cold, mud beneath your boots, or the bite of leather straps digging into your chest. Instead, you find yourself wrapped in stillness, as though the world itself has paused to let you rest. Take a slow breath. Picture the camp fading into mist behind you, its smoke and canvas dissolving like morning fog. All the quarrels, the snores, the restless dreams, they belong to the past now, distant echoes no longer tugging at your thoughts. What remains is only the rhythm of your own breathing, steady and calm, like the hush of waves against a quiet shore. The soldier's life was never gentle, and perhaps that is why these moments of calm feel so precious. Even in the harshest nights, men found ways to cling to warmth, whether through shared cloaks, whispered prayers, or the laughter of crude jokes. And in remembering that, you can find your own comfort too. The knowledge that endurance is stitched from small mercies, that peace can be woven from fragments of chaos. Imagine now that you are no longer lying on straw, but on something softer, something that cradles rather than scratches. The draft of cold air is gone, replaced by a gentle warmth that wraps around you like a trusted cloak. The sounds of the camp have melted away, leaving only a soft hush, the kind that makes your eyelids heavier with every breath. Your mind may try to replay the march, the weight of the day, the flicker of firelight in the tent. Let it fade. There is no trumpet calling you forward now, no officer shaking your shoulder, no need to rise before you are ready. The night stretches before you like a wide plain, unbroken, calm, endless. You may walk across it if you like, but you don't have to. You can simply lie here, safe, at ease, letting the silence settle into your bones. And as the silence deepens, you might feel the threads of memory weaving together, not of cold or hunger, but of those rare comforts that always found a way to shine through. The low hum of a song, the faint warmth of shared breath, the steady rhythm of prayer beads slipping through calloused fingers. These are the fragments that linger when the hardship is gone. The reminders that even in struggle, humanity endures. Let your thoughts soften now. The canvas fades, the straw dissolves, the cold retreats. What remains is only you, wrapped in calm, drifting slowly toward the kind of rest soldiers longed for but rarely found. And unlike them, you don't have to rise at dawn or march through mud or fight for survival in the dark. You are safe, here, now, with nothing left to do but breathe and rest and dream. So close your eyes. Let the night carry you, gently this time. The story has ended, and all that remains is quiet.